Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Today is Friday, November 3rd, 2017, starting at 9:53 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, and this is the 131st episode of the show. Joining me today is Leisa Scheim and Patrick Watson, and we're going to be doing a retrospective of some Saturn return stories that we've seen over the past couple of years since Saturn has been passing through Sagittarius. So for more information about how to subscribe to the podcast and support the production of future episodes by becoming a patron, please visit theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. I think that's all the preliminary stuff. So, hey guys, welcome back to the show.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I can't believe, on the one hand, I can't believe it's been 2 years since we did the original Saturn and Sagittarius podcast, as Saturn had just moved or was just moving into that sign. But on the other hand, I thought it would have been like 3 years. I was actually surprised to see that we did that in September of 2015. So it was only 2 years ago that we did that. Does that feel like a long time ago, or does it feel like a short time to you guys?
Kind of long for me. Yeah, actually, I'm surprised it's not more like 3.
Feels like a
you, Patrick?
lifetime. Feels like a lifetime. I mean, so much has changed since that transit. Yeah, for me personally, at least.
Yeah, you are one of our you're not even honorary, we're both honorary Saturn return people, but you actually went through your Saturn return over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I'm finally not young anymore. Finally joined you guys
Right.
as a true adult, astrologically. Yeah, I mean, we'll get into what my one was about, I'm sure, but
Sure.
yeah, it was pretty brutal. It wasn't very fun. I don't recommend it. 2 stars.
Don't recommend it. So yeah, 2 out of 5 stars would not recommend. All right. Well, we will be sharing the stories of some other people, and then eventually we'll come back to and talk about yours later on in the show. So I've been wanting to do this show for a while because, we did that interesting episode. I forget what episode number it was. It was like episode 40 or something on Saturn and Sagittarius when it was first going in. And in the first half, it was like Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees, and we talked about like that as a mundane astrology type thing. But then in the second half, the three of us talked about some Saturn return stories that we were looking forward to of people that we knew had Saturn in Sagittarius. So they would be experiencing either their first or second or third Saturn return. And since that time, over the past couple of years, I think all three of us, and lots of astrologers, have seen a lot of interesting Saturn return stories, as you've actually seen some of those people that were born in the mid to late 1980s go through their first Saturn returns, or some of the people born in the late 1950s going through their second Saturn returns. And I've been collecting together different stories and meaning to share them and do a show kind of talking about some of the things that I've observed or some of the stories that I've seen now that we're finally to the end of it. And we're not quite there, but we're just about, I guess, a month away from Saturn in Capricorn, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe 6 weeks.
Yeah, so I think this is an opportune time to finally do this and to talk about some of these Saturn return stories, because for me, the Saturn return really begins with the ingress of Saturn back into your natal Saturn sign, and it fully officially ends once Saturn departs that sign. So we're close enough to the end right now that we're pretty much at the end of the Saturn return in Sagittarius, and I think we're in a good position to talk about most of these stories, even though some people might have Saturn at like 28 or 29, and so theirs might culminate over the course of the next month. But for the most part, most of the things surrounding the Saturn returns have been going on for a lot of people for a couple of years now. So, all right, we've got a lot of stories to talk about today, and I'm actually not even sure how we're going to get through them all, or if we're going to get through them all, but we're going to make our best effort to get through a bunch of Saturn return stories to talk about some of the the general sort of overview of what it seems to have coincided with for a number of different people that we've seen, because we've seen pretty much the full gamut of different manifestations, I think, based on different positions of Saturn in the chart, based on different rulerships, different and other things going on. And I think we'll see a lot of interesting overlap and similarities. But before we actually get into the stories, I wanted to talk a little bit and sort of establish what our approach is going to be and talk a little bit about how we interpret Saturn returns. So what should be our starting point for that? Should we just sort of define the subject first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Saturn has an orbital cycle of 29 point something years. And so every 29, I think it's like 29.4 or 29.6 years, Saturn returns to the place it was all those years before. And like you said, Chris, it's really the ingress into the sign and its entire stay during the sign. But there is also the Saturn return to the degree, which tends to be sort of that much more pivotal for people who have Saturn at that particular degree. But there are different ways it can turn up there depending on how it's situated in the chart or what kind of chart it is, like a day or night chart, for example.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, that's the way usually Saturn return is defined as like when Saturn returns to the exact degree it was when you were born, or at least within that range of, let's say, a few degrees in the zodiac. But this, one of the principles that I've had for about 10 years now is that using whole sign aspects and using whole sign houses, that when you switch to using those, you start to pay attention to the broader sort of range of things like transits. Even once a planet moves into a new sign, it's moving into a new house, it's moving into a new set of aspects or sign-based configurations with other planets. And, this has really, the past 2 years have really reemphasized that to me, that the Saturn return really does start as soon as Saturn ingresses back into the natal sign, and it ends officially once it leaves that sign. So it's true that oftentimes there's a sort of pivotal turning point where the most intense phase of the return is certainly when it gets right around the specific range of degrees around your exact Saturn return. But you can really see a lot of the narratives sort of developing already as soon as the ingress takes place, it seems like. Do you guys feel like that's been reinforced for you as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like we are all pretty much like on the same page around the sign-based, but also the degree-based. You feel the same way, Patrick?
Yeah. I mean,
yeah?
I mean, I don't want to get right into my example, but I mean, I think the ingress of Saturn into Sagittarius was pretty dramatic for me in terms of, kind of right out of the gate, kind of being like, yeah, this is what this Saturn return is going to be about. It's going to be about your kids. My daughter was born, close to the ingress of Saturn into Sagittarius, which is my fifth house, the house of children. So yeah, it was pretty just almost like, duh. It was almost like it's so blatant, so kind of obvious that it's like, yeah, well, that's when Saturn return really, begins.
Sure.
Okay. And I know we said we were going to put it off until later, but maybe it would be worth it to just get into it, because in terms of that, because we were trying to figure out how to structure this and we still don't know. So I just wanted to let it flow as a conversation. But one of the ways I thought about structuring it was, as we talk about and introduce different interpretive principles, maybe we could pull out some of the examples that are relevant. So maybe that would be a good starting point. So you have Saturn in the fifth house, the fifth whole sign house natally. You have Leo rising and Saturn and Sagittarius in the fifth.
Yes.
And so as soon as Saturn ingressed, what happened?
So we, my wife and I, we both have Leo rising, and we both have Saturn in the fifth. And we were both in a Saturn perfection. We were both in our fifth house perfections. And we were kind of unsure about whether we wanted a third child. We were sort of back and forth on it. By the way, never a good thing to be kind of iffy about, like whether you're going to have like a third child. Yeah,
like it's kind of like, what are you going to have for dinner tonight?
It's a bit more binary, I would. So,
right.
But yeah, so we discovered that she was pregnant on January 26th of. I figured out that we conceived around like January 3rd to January 8th of 2015. And then we discovered the pregnancy on January 26th of 2015. And then she was born on October 1st, 2015. So I think Saturn was right at like 0 Sagittarius when we conceived. And then it regressed back into Scorpio and then came back again into Sagittarius when she was born. So it's right around 0 or 1 Sagittarius that she was born. So like literally, we conceived when Sagittarius like stepped into the sign, and then most of the pregnancies during Saturn and Scorpio, and then Saturn enters Sagittarius again. It's like, here's a baby. Here's this thing you can barely handle. Here's like the straw that will break your back. This is the I mean, she's adorable. I love her, obviously, but like, I'd be lying if I said like it's been totally easy, like balancing all of this stuff. And the third child was kind of just like the cherry on the shit sundae, like of just I mean, a lot of 6th and 7th house issues go along with this too, because those are the houses ruled in our charts. So
Sure.
my issues of like my employment were kind of up in the air, and so like that's been kind of hard on sort of the work front, and deciding like who has the responsibility of work and bringing in what we need for the family, and obviously that's causes tension in any marriage, but all of it just kind of came together in this perfect combination of terrible things kind of all at once. I mean, I guess I'm not being very clear, but
no, it's good. I mean,
I'm
so
just trying to remember it.
I just want to clarify.
Yes.
You're reminding me of something that I completely forgot about, because we recorded the Saturn and Sag episode, that podcast, in September of 2015, because that was when Saturn finally officially departed from Scorpio for the last time and went into Sagittarius for the final time. But in fact, Saturn had already dipped into Sagittarius earlier that year. So it dipped into Sagittarius. The first time was what, January?
I think it was December of 2014.
Yeah, it's December 2014.
Okay, so December of 2014, Saturn first goes into Sagittarius, and it stays there for a few months in early Sag before retrograding out. And so what you figured out was that you guys conceived in like January of 2015, shortly after Saturn first went into Sagittarius.
Yes.
So, and that's a really good example also, because you have Saturn later in the sign by degree. It's at like 15 degrees or something, right? 17,
yeah. Yeah, and she has 14, I have 17.
Maybe I should go ahead and show it. So do you mind if I show your chart?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. And so let's go ahead and share that. So for those watching the video version of this that I'm going to try to put on YouTube, as long as the video comes out okay, I'm going to go ahead and show the charts while we talk about them. But otherwise, if you're listening to the audio version, we'll just try and describe what we're looking at in general terms. So just remember, we're using whole sign houses. So once you know the rising sign, you know what house everything else is located in just by knowing its signs. So Patrick has Leo rising, and he has Saturn at 17 degrees of Sagittarius, and it's in the 5th whole sign house, or it's in the 5th sign relative to the rising sign. So we would expect, children to be a major topic that might be associated with a Saturn return. And basically, as soon as Saturn ingressed, you guys conceived. And so part of the theme for you, or part of the issue that you were talking about, just to understand that better for our listeners, is that you guys actually already had 2 children, and you weren't necessarily planning on having more, but this was kind of a unexpected surprise.
A tad, and we have Uranus in 5th.
And that's really important, because that ended up being a recurring theme that I kept noticing over and over again, is that those people with Saturn and Sag that were born in the late 1980s, a bunch of them had Uranus at least in the same sign, if not pretty close to a conjunction with Saturn in Sagittarius. And so a large theme for a lot of these Saturn returns that we're going to look at is a Uranus thing of something unexpected that sort of comes out of nowhere.
Well, right. Usually when you have 2 planets in conjunction, they kind of each act like the other, So, for example, people with Saturn conjunct Uranus, their Saturn transits will have some Uranian elements, and vice versa. So yeah, I think that definitely applies. The other funny thing too is, with Saturn in the 5th, there's this, I forget exactly where it comes from, but there's this some traditional signification of Saturn in the 5th as being the father of another person's children. And so my first child is actually my stepchild. And then my second child is my biological child. And then this third child is my second biological child. So all of these, all of that sort of came to bear.
Right.
But,
So, and this is a really good demonstration, like I was saying, of because you have Saturn, towards the middle of the sign at 17 degrees, this is a great demonstration of, the Saturn return actually begins as soon as it ingresses into that sign. Because some modern astrologers would overlook that because they would say,
right.
well, it's not going to be an orb until it gets within, 6 degrees or 10 degrees
Not
or
the
whatever.
case.
Yeah.
Not the case, clearly. I mean, wow.
Yeah, I've had people tell me that it's not actually the Saturn return when the Saturn return has started. At least from my perspective, it started. And they're like, no, you're not going through your Saturn return yet because it's not close in degree. So
yeah, something makes me think that when I'm around 59, I'm probably going to end up being like a grandparent, being a father of other people's children. Like, I wonder if I'll kind of have to do this again in some way, or like if I'll have to, like maybe my children will have children, but like they won't be, I may have to take some sort of larger role in raising them or something. So then I kind of have to get back into the grind of diapers and stuff. And yeah, not really looking forward to that. But
right, because that's brilliant, because now your third child will have Saturn in Sag as well.
Yeah,
and so she'll have her.
Yeah, no, this sucks. This is not supposed to happen. This is not the plan of my life, but it totally was. I saw it all along. My first child actually was born with Saturn in Scorpio, and he's actually the Saturn return of my older brother. So that was essentially my mother had her first child when Saturn was in late Scorpio, and then she had her first grandchild when Saturn was in late Scorpio. So there was kind of a Saturn cycle there with my mother, from becoming a mother to becoming a grandmother. And so, yeah, this Saturn and Sag thing is probably going to follow me down now 30 years from now. So
I mean, if it makes you feel any better, that happens quite a lot, I feel. But I've seen a lot of like parent-child, Saturn return connections.
Yeah, what's funny though is, I mean, the fifth house is supposed to be like a fun house. The thing that sucks about having Saturn in the fifth, I think this is the thing that sucks about having Saturn generally in a so-called good house, is that what is supposed to be good, like, is just so hard. Like, I know people who have, just, amazing experiences for being parents, and, their children bring them, honors, or, I think of like parents who, have kids who are like, child stars or something,
like Justin
right,
Bieber or something like that.
Yeah, but with Saturn, I mean, I imagine that, going forward, who knows, I mean, with Saturn in the fifth, maybe that means like, my kids are fuck-ups or something, and I have to, just deal with it the whole way through. So I'm really hoping it's not quite as bad as that. But, I mean, I think my example, the thing that my example really proves for me, and hopefully this is convincing for everyone listening, is that the ingress into the sign is not to be underestimated. That is absolutely the preview of what kind of the whole thing is about. And it is uncanny with how literally connected to the topic of the house that it is. So,
right. And what was the final birthday then? You said it was right after Saturn made its ingress later that fall?
It was October 1st, 2015.
Oh, wow. That was literally like a week or two after Saturn went back into Sagittarius for the next 2 years. And it was still only at like 1 degree of Sagittarius at that point.
Yeah.
So we're still 16 degrees away from the exact Saturn return, but you were firmly in Saturn return territory at that point.
Yeah. The Saturn return by degree, it was kind of a blur. That was right after the election, and it was because this Saturn return wasn't just about children for me. It was also about me in some ways taking my it was kind of taking my hobby as an astrologer and turning a little bit more into a serious career. And so that was right after the election where, I'd gotten this big prediction wrong, and I had a real kind of crisis of with what I was going to do and if I like really should even continue doing astrology. And so you can kind of see some connections there with Jupiter ruling the sign, that there was this big sort of philosophical sort of quandary that I know a lot of astrologers messed up too, but it was something that I those are some really dark days. I mean, I remember Beth like telling me I did have to get out of bed. I did have to, still go to work, and I did have to kind of figure out. And she's like, you can't just quit astrology over this, like, so I really had to kind of get through that. And that was right after that was when I established my brand as an astrologer, this, Big Fat Astro thing. And
sure. So you set up a new website because you had a previous one, but you launched a new website and a new YouTube channel, which is Where can people find that again?
So you can go to my website is www.bigfatastro.com. You can find me on Facebook, which is facebook.com/bigfatastro. You can find me on Twitter, P Watson Astro. My YouTube channel is called Big Fat Astro Vlog. So you can see my Big Fat Astro vlog there. But yeah, so the Saturn return for me by degree was me having to get over the mistake I made, and to I guess fully kind of embrace myself as an astrologer. And
right, setting up. And when you also ended up in the Washington Post, is this another fun minor thing that happened?
And that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, there was that huge thing with the Washington Post where that was the Uranus conjunction to my Jupiter. That was also when I did my first lecture at an astrological conference. I spoke at the ISAR conference. So there were it was like a new moon or full moon. I forget which.
So there's a lot of ninth house. So that's important because I can actually already think of one or two other charts where that also is relevant, where the ruler of that sign, the ruler of Saturn's sign and its placement by house actually becomes partially descriptive of some of the major themes that come up during the course of the Saturn return.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, the ninth house significations of, travel, not so much. I mean, I did travel to go to the conference and stuff, but definitely the ninth house significations of publishing and philosophy,
just astrology
itself is considered. Yeah, so that's definitely part of the equation.
Sure. I mean, you literally, and because that's not an unimportant, because I was thinking about that the other day because I was just reliving the whole nightmare that was a year ago when the ESAR conference happened, and then a few weeks later the election happened. But one of the things it's either to forget or to overlook is for 2 weeks before the ESAR conference was this mad scramble because ESAR announced that they had Hillary Clinton's birth time and they weren't going to release it until the panel happened at the end of the conference. And then you and I spent a couple of weeks trying to research this, trying to get them to release the birth time, them completely fucking around and just screwing over a lot of astrologers in the process. And then eventually this led through this weird route, you talking with a reporter from the Washington Post and then being quoted in the very headline where it said, this is not to be trusted. This birth time is not to be trusted. And so,
Saturn and Sag.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some interesting themes there just in terms of the ninth house and you're switching and doing astrology more as your profession and launching the YouTube channel that's been successful and everything else. So I know, so we've got the fifth house theme. And then of course the fifth house theme was that in having an unexpected third child, that did bring some additional financial and other sort of strains into your life for the next couple of years, right? Basically that was part of it.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's just so funny to hear you put it. It sounds almost so delicate the way you say it. Yes, that does describe it.
Okay. So, and that was of course, and then it's reinforced because as you mentioned already, your wife also has Leo rising and Saturn in Sagittarius in the fifth house. And do you both have night charts or is it just you that has the night chart?
She was born with the sun a couple degrees below the horizon. So she's one of these twilight births where we're not really sure, but it might be kind of daytime. I mean, a lot of her struggles have kind of been in parallel with mine. Obviously, having a third child was a much bigger problem for her since she is the mom. I mean, undeniably, it was harder for her in every way. Especially because she wanted to breastfeed, which is a huge commitment. And I mean, that literally means I mean, I don't think she got sleep maybe for like maybe a whole year. She was really, really difficult. And she's been wanting to, move ahead in her career. And, a lot of the sort of the choices that I've made have sort of had impacts on like her ability to do kind of what she wants to do. And so it's, so seventh house issues came up with, the Saturn return, trying to decide, are we best off like together, so that was really scary, how close, we, have come, or how we've kind of dealt with the topic of, potentially of divorce and sort of deciding to stay, together. I mean, it'd be crazy. It would be even worse. Life would be even worse if we were trying to do this separately. And then sixth house, employment, what helps you and what you do, since it's the 10th, those issues came up, with what she wants to do for work, what I want to do for work, how we're going to manage the children, which of course ties back to Saturn, that we both have Saturn in the 5th. So yeah.
Sure. So one of the interpretive principles I meant that we should outline as we're doing this is, this is something originally I had developed largely through doing consultations and through just using the basic principles of Hellenistic astrology in a modern context, and taking some of those ideas from ancient astrology and trying to apply it to more modern ideas and transit theory like the Saturn return. And one of the things I kept seeing is that obviously the whole sign house that Saturn is placed in, that the topics associated with that house will become more prominent during the Saturn return, but also the two houses that Saturn rules, the topics associated with those two houses often come into play as well in different ways during the course of the Saturn return. And that's something I know, Leisa, you've seen, and that's something that in your lecture, where you did a lecture on Saturn returns, that's something you really draw out very clearly in a lot of your example charts, how that dynamic often unfolds, right?
Yeah, definitely. And usually you can notice both the house that Saturn is natally placed in, as well as at least one, if not both, of the houses that it rules, the Capricorn house and the Aquarius house. So I'd say definitely the house placement, and then it often all three. Sometimes just 2 out of 3, but often all 3.
Well, and then as well as the ruler, whatever planet rules the sign, stands in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've really noticed in a few of the examples, I was looking at the sign placement of the Jupiter, because these are all Saturn and Sagittarius, the sign placement of the Jupiter being really interesting in altering in different ways the tenor of their particular Saturn return.
Right. So that's going to be one of our primary interpretive principles as we go through here, is like the house Saturn is in, the 2 houses that it rules, and other things like that. The other thing, of course, is the sect of the chart, which is it a day chart or a night chart? And one of the things I would continually see was that just based on the principle of sect, one of the interpretive distinctions is that people with day charts tend to experience the Saturn return as being a little bit easier, a little bit more constructive, whereas people with night charts tend to have a little bit more of a difficult time with the Saturn return, and you tend to hear them report it as being a bit more challenging and having sometimes greater hardships that come along with it. And there are exceptions to that, because there's mitigating rules. There's different types of mitigations that can happen that can throw that off one way or another, especially in terms of how Saturn is configured with other planets in the chart, like Venus and Jupiter being the 2 benefics that are able to mitigate things for the better, and Mars, for example, being the other malefic that's able to mitigate things oftentimes the worse, depending on how they're aspecting Saturn. So, one of the things in talking with you, Patrick, about your story is that you certainly experienced this as a much more challenging time, and that seems consistent with what we would expect since you have a night chart, and so you're experiencing more of a sort of challenging end of Saturn type Saturn return.
Yes.
Would you say that's accurate?
It's so clinical the way you put it. Yes.
I know. I'm trying to be very neutral and
diplomatic.
Right.
No, yeah, it was pretty awful. I'm almost glad to see Saturn and Capricorn.
Yeah.
I'm happy for it to be over.
And we'll see both ends of that spectrum with some of the other Saturn returns that we're going to talk about. And that's one of the things that's funny, because a lot of the ones I was getting was day chart ones. And so I was just like constructive story, surmountable difficulties, minor mishap. And then I got one of my first night chart ones, and she was just like retelling this horror story of really difficult times. And then it reminded me, I forgot that up to that point I had mainly been getting day chart ones.
Yeah.
So
that makes a big difference. I think Patrick and I, both being night chart people, can attest.
Yeah. So we're going to, I think we've introduced most of the basic interpretive principles that we're going to focus on. The only other major thing I wanted to do is, Leisa, you had written down, and you had at the beginning of your Saturn Returns lecture, you did a really good job of stating some of the like standard modern interpretive principles of how the Saturn return is usually viewed. And I was wondering if we could talk about that for a few minutes, just to give an initial setup and some context for what we would expect to see in some of the charts that we're going to look at.
Sure. So, I mean, there's kind of some main ways that people often talk about it. So it's either like major achievements or major downfalls, major difficulties. It's often talked about as reevaluating your life choices at that time. Endings and beginnings, I think, are just about universal. And then the theme of like hard work, like it'll always be kind of like you're working hard on something, whatever that is in your chart, however that's signified. So hard work, persistence, it can be talked about as like a time of testing or challenges. And then I think one of the other main things is like the reality principle, like making things real or concrete, because Saturn sort of governs things that are in real life. And so as opposed to like your ideals or something, so can you translate what you're doing into real concrete life? So those are, I think, some of the main ones.
Okay. And the last thing I meant to mention that I skipped, which I know shows up more prominently in some of your examples, Leisa, is that the other thing is, of course, the nature of the sign that Saturn is in the birth chart as being relevant to some of the themes. And so I know in a lot of the example charts I found, I often saw the houses are often focused on the houses, and the houses that Saturn ruled or was placed in as being more relevant. Whereas in some of the example charts, you've really drawn out some of the Saturn and Sag themes as, or you found some examples where that was much more prominent.
Yeah, and it's kind of surprising because usually I do really focus on like time charts and the exact, houses that are being ruled and so forth. And those usually are very telling. But for some reason, I just came across a bunch of Saturn and Sag examples that weren't necessarily time charts. Some of them were, but that just were really evocative in terms of the sign itself.
Right. Yeah. So that's actually something maybe we should get out of the way first is, and I keep repeating this over and over the past year or two to Austin and Kelly on each month's forecast episode, where I'm just like, I cannot believe how literal Saturn and Sagittarius has been over the past 2 years. And if you go back and listen to that show and some of the things that we talked about anticipating happening, either based on symbolic reasoning, based on what we expected from putting like Saturn and Sagittarius together, or based on, past historical things, which is something you've focused on a lot, Patrick, I was still continually blown away by how literal the Saturn and Sagittarius significations really manifested over the past couple of years. And we had some like inkling of that we started to get at the beginning of Saturn and Sag in 2015, such as, for example, the whole immigration and like migration that was happening from the Middle East to Europe was sort of really getting going at that time under the summer. But I don't think we could have anticipated, we couldn't have anticipated, we did to some extent, but it's still, the way that it turned out was very striking, I felt like. What did you guys think?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's been almost like a caricature in some ways of some of the themes, crossing boundaries and getting from, I know, Patrick, you've talked about like literally getting from one place to another physically, but then culturally, it's like the same thing. Like, these people who are over there, and are they too far away from me to relate to? And, who belongs to my group and who's like the out group.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of the Saturn Sagittarius period of the late 1830s. I think like 1838 to 1840. Like that's the Trail of Tears episode. That like Amistad. From the same one. that's definitely you can definitely see kind of the historical reverberations of this idea of migration of culture and peoples, it's so literal. It's weird. It's almost like astrology works or something.
I know, it's almost as if it were.
It's like just a real phenomenon.
Well,
go ahead. I'm glad I haven't lost that yet, that I'm still continuously impressed that it works to the extent that it does.
Right. Well, I was going to say also Sagittarius in terms of differences, because Sagittarian is often about like crossing differences, and Saturn being like either an impediment to that, or like you either work on that or you say no and kind of put a hard, wall down and say, no, we're not going to cross those differences between different kinds of people or different cultures. That's just ended up being a huge theme of the last few years in lots of different ways.
The wall.
Yeah, the wall, exactly.
Build that wall.
Yeah.
That was one of Trump's slogans, was build the wall.
Right, that, and it also feels, I'm sure there's other, bigger cycles that are additionally lending themselves to this, but there's been so many sort of nativist, nationalist kind of movements in so many countries recently. And it keeps feeling to me like a sort of a closer drawing of boundaries rather than a wanting to go further.
Right. One thing that
is a Saturn thing.
Right, absolutely. One thing I was just reminded of is, one of the defining moments of kind of contention between the United States and the former Soviet Union was the launching of Sputnik. That was from the Saturn Sagittarius period of 1957 to 1959. That sort of kicked off this space race, and so I think it's interesting then. Obviously, 30 years after that, in the late 80s, during that Saturn Sagittarius period, that was when Russia launched the first space station, Mir. That was the Saturn return of the launch of Sputnik. And it was also the time of the Challenger disaster. So literally, like, the idea of like going places, to space, was kind of put on hold as NASA said, in fact, NASA was also started during that 1957 to 1959 Saturn Sagittarius period, and there's a whole organization about going places, and so I think it's interesting that, again, like Russia and the United States and the sort of feelings of like trespass that have happened, over the course of these allegations of Russian meddling in the American election in 2016, all kind of taking place during the Saturn Sagittarius period, which has been there before, at these sort of prior junctions, between these two countries, the United States and Russia. So I think there's other ways it's shown up too, but yeah, that just sort of reminded me of this recurrent theme of nativism, skepticism or fear of the frontier, as well as other cultures and cultural barriers and things like that.
Yeah, that idea of fear, like that. There's some book, or maybe it's like a lot of modern astrology books, but I remember reading one back in the early to mid 2000s, very early in my like studies as an astrologer, where they really said one of the underlying psychological themes of Saturn is fear, either where you have personal fear in your chart, or sometimes where there are collective fears. And this is the first time that I've really seen that come out in a major way, because I feel like that was like one of the dominant themes of Saturn and Sagittarius, was like fear of that which is foreign.
Definitely.
And how that manifested in different ways.
Also fear of the frontier, fear of going distances, like, and I didn't really understand that until we got to this Saturn Sagittarius period. For example, I did this whole study on bridges. Now, I'm not the kind of person who like obsesses about like bridges or has like one of those weird hobbies where they're like obsessed with like trains or something. But I got into it a little bit over the course of studying Saturn Sagittarius, just because it's come up as such a common theme of when Saturn ingresses into a new sign, we tend to build things and concretize things that are related to the nature of the sign. So when Saturn's Sagittarius, we tend to build bridges or freeways. We tend to connect places. We literally build things that allow people to go from one place to another. And, the sign of Sagittarius and rule of Jupiter kind of have these connotations of, broadening horizons. And so the way this connects to Saturn and Sagittarius is that, a lot of these, it's funny, back when we, well, what am I trying to say? Oh yeah, back when we, when trains were still a new thing, people were afraid of going on trains. They thought that if you went past 100 miles an hour, that your head would explode, and obviously that wasn't true, but people have also had fears about using planes. And then in the 1927 to 1929 Saturn Sagittarius period, flight was considered to be commercially viable, considered to be safe after that point. So then people kind of got over their fears of flying on planes. And I think the same thing is kind of happening with space flight. It's the fear. I mean, would you want to get on a space shuttle? Would you want to get on one of Elon Musk's planes, to go to space? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it would be cool, but also pretty, scary. And I think that this has been this Saturn Sagittarius period, we've seen, a similar development with space flight. Elon Musk, he's showed that he has been able to build a rocket which can be reused. And this is very similar to these previous developments with Saturn Sagittarius with trains and with planes. So Saturn Sagittarius is like about that fear of going on a trip or going, on a dangerous voyage, whether it's on a train or on a plane across the ocean or, in a plane to space. So
yeah, you really drew that out, and I have to my hat goes off to you, because if people go back and listen to that, I'd recommend people listen to that original Saturn and Sagittarius episode and the article you wrote on your website about it, because you really called a lot of those travel things that came up, both with things like SpaceX, where there have been some important and notable setbacks, but also some notable sort of developments and advancements. Yeah. But then also other forms of travel that we saw come out and suddenly start being more prominent during this time, like the Hyperloop. Yeah. We did see some major developments with that, which I think you called as well.
Yeah. I guess this would be as good a time as any. I'm just going to go quickly through my little list here of bridges and highways.
Well, and I don't even, because one of the things, we're 43 minutes into it, so I don't know how much we should focus. Okay. I want to kind of pull back from the mundane thing a little bit.
Sure.
But I do want to recommend that everybody check out those articles on your website. And I mean, are you going to post this perhaps as a follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely could. I apologize in advance though, because Photo Bucket sucks, and so all of my images for that article were hosted by Photo Bucket, and then Photo Bucket is now holding my photos ransom. So if you're on the page there, there's like all these broken links, but I'm gonna go back and fix it. It's gonna take a long time. So, but yeah, feel free to go ahead and go to my website and you look up, just search in the search bar like Saturn Sagittarius, you'll find it. It's called Saturn Sagittarius, the skeptic, the architect, and the something. I forget.
Right. I mean, just search Patrick Watson.
I think.
The Luddite. Yeah, that's right. The fear of progress.
Mm-hmm.
Right. All right. So let's start getting into some Saturn in Sagittarius, Saturn returns, and talking about this, because my initial fear about us getting through the chart, all the chart examples, has just been heightened by taking 45 minutes to get through the first one. So let's, speaking of Saturn and fears, so maybe a good transition point is that since we've just been talking about Saturn and Sag and some of the manifestations in terms of mundane astrology, I know, Leisa, you had some examples that were very Saturn and Sag-like that seemed to draw out primarily the sign and the quality of that sign and different manifestations of it in a very interesting way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a few different ones. Maybe I'll start with one of the first ones. I definitely want to get to the second Saturn return one, but maybe we can, for flowing more quickly, maybe I'll start with the first one.
Okay.
So that's going to be Colin Kaepernick, who's been in the news quite a lot in the past year.
Okay, I will go ahead and share the chart right now for the video. So this is an untimed chart, right?
This is an untimed chart, one of several I have. And it's funny though, it's actually his birthday today, November 3rd.
Oh.
So he turns 30 today, November 3rd, 1987, and that's Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So he has Saturn at 18 Sag, and it's both trine and ruled by Jupiter in Aries, just like Patrick's. And so I'm sure lots of people listening to this know who he is at this point, but just in case someone doesn't, he's an NFL football player who became famous from, say, last fall onward for sitting and then later kneeling during the national anthem before the football games in protest of police brutality against African Americans, extrajudicial killings, and things like that. So it was like a political protest or human rights protest at the football games that he was then going to play afterwards. And this has sparked like a huge nationwide discussion, largely not about topics that he was intending the protest to be about. But
Right.
it's turned into a nationwide discussion about freedom of expression, which is kind of interestingly, Jupiterian, Saturn and Sag ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter sometimes indicating freedom issues, about racism, about police brutality, patriotism. So that's kind of the gist. And he's been a free agent. He was signed before, but he's been a free agent since March of this year. And there's sort of an ongoing discussion about whether his personal protest has caused him to not be signed by teams this year, or whether that's incidental and it's about his playing.
Right. So that's a really important. Well, one of the things, obviously, in terms of interpretation that we can't unfortunately know is we don't know if this is since we don't have a time, we don't know if it's a day chart or a night chart. So we don't know if he would be theoretically experiencing some of the more constructive end of it or the more, hardship end of it.
Right.
But the fact that he's not, that last season, a year ago, he was in the NFL and he did these protests, and then it sparked a lot of controversy. And then this year, the football is back in season again, and he's not on a team this year. And it's widely speculated that it's partially due to his starting these protests.
You know what I think is kind of funny, and again, also kind of literal? What part of the body does Sagittarius rule?
The thighs?
The leg, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the knee, the stopping.
Oh, yeah.
Kneeling down on the knee, to protest. And what I think is kind of funny is this reminds me of another kneeling football player from a while ago who also was Saturn Sagittarius, Tim Tebow, except he was kneeling to, do this like public prayer.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting, as a sort of point of comparison between, the Colin Kaepernick, the guy with Saturn Sagittarius who kneels to protest against, injustice or to protest for justice.
Right.
And then the other Saturn and Sagittarius football player who kneels publicly to, pray, to express himself religiously in a public way. I just think it's kind of funny how they're both Saturn and Saggy. They both have this same placement, and both have brought kind of criticism to themselves in this act of kneeling. Saturn and Sag. Anyway.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the things I thought was interesting, it kind of reminded me, this particular example reminded me of the general thing that different astrologers can kind of interpret things like that, transits like this in different ways, depending on their own personal leanings, and still be kind of correct about a part of it. Because for instance, Saturn also rules consequences. And so, one could say that, he's experiencing a Saturn return by experiencing a consequence of making this decision. And that might be true. But the other piece of it that I thought was kind of interesting is that Saturn and Sag ruled by Jupiter, Jupiter also has to do with beliefs. And so this feels very much like a Saturn and Sagittarius standing up for one's beliefs, regardless of consequences.
Or kneeling.
Yes, or kneeling. Exactly. And I found this great quote. He said in one of the interviews, "This is not something that I'm going to run by anybody. I am not looking for approval. I have to stand up for people that are oppressed. If they take football away, my endorsements from me, I know that I stood up for what is right. And that feels both very much expressing the Saturn in Sagittarius, standing up for one's beliefs, but also that being ruled by Jupiter in Aries, because it was kind of emphasizing that he was willing to stand alone, which he was for a while, you know.
Well, and it's in the realm of sports, athleticism, you know, brought by Mars. So,
and you know, it was only recently that more people joined in, so that felt very much like the Jupiter in Aries ruling that Saturn and Sag piece of it. Yeah, so anyway, that is a lot of what people have heard about his Saturn return. And I was going to say earlier, I'm really glad that we aren't recording this until just a month before the end of Saturn and Sag, because there's been a couple more events in a few people's lives right at the end here, especially for people who have Saturn later. But for him, he, two things. One, he filed a grievance against the NFL for alleged collusion just this month. Well, actually last month, so a couple weeks ago. And I don't know where that's going to go, but that's obviously kind of a big deal, you know. And a lot of times with these events during a Saturn return, it tells an ongoing story, but you might not see kind of the follow through yet until a little bit after the return is over. So that's one piece. But this other piece that I really love is that he just signed like a week ago. He reportedly signed a $1 million book deal with a Random House imprint called One World, which is like so Sagittarian. I was sad to see that it wasn't actually started, the imprint, during Saturn and Sag, although it was restarted recently during Saturn and Sag. But One World is just such a Sagittarian title.
Interesting. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, you know, we're pretty close to the end of Saturn and Sag, but it's not quite there yet. We're in the last month, but Saturn, as we're recording this, is at late 24 degrees of Sagittarius. And that's actually kind of tricky because there's some people with it, you know, at the very end of Saturn at the very end of Sagittarius in their natal chart. Like there's one chart I just noticed for, you know, Hope Hicks, who is that she's an assistant to President Trump, and she has Saturn, I think, at like 27 Sagittarius. So she's about to have her exact Saturn return in the next, you know, couple of weeks. And they just announced that the FBI wanted to interview her in mid-November, which must be around the time of her exact Saturn return. So there's some people like that who, you know, they're the most intense, the Saturn return has been in effect and it's been building up for the past 2 years, but the exact return is going to hit right at the end of that period. And so the most intense part might still happen, you know, in this next month.
Yeah,
another one is the guy who recently drove his truck through New Yorkers. I forget his name, but I found out his birth date is like February 8th, 1988. And it's
really?
Saturn is at 29.
Oh, wow.
Conjunct Uranus at 29. So he's going to be obviously brought forth for charges, you know, for this act of terrorism, you know, probably around the Saturn return. So bit of a grim one.
Well,
right.
I saw
Although
that
that's
too.
interesting with Saturn and Sag as a theme.
Yeah.
Right. I was actually trying to find his birth
Charlie
date
Hebdo.
as well.
Yeah.
Because it sounded like a Saturn and Sag, and he was 29.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and that's another theme of Saturn Sag is, you know, religious
like
tension.
Fanaticism.
Yeah.
Fervor, religious fervor.
Right.
Yeah.
Osama bin Laden was born with Saturn and Sag.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So that's a good first example of Saturn and Sag with Colin Kaepernick. And that's a good point. I mean, that has been really interesting because, you know, Leisa and I have both, you know, friends who are like liberals who are astrologers and friends who are conservatives that are astrologers. And it's sometimes been interesting seeing how those two groups will interpret, you know, something like this transit in different ways based on their political beliefs. But there's certain like sort of core themes, it seems like, that are there that are sort of unarguable regardless of how you're looking at his story and his situation or what your personal views are on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So did you have another Saturn and Sag, or should we jump to some of the other examples that might be relevant at this point, Leisa?
I have another Saturn and Sag, but maybe you can go first and then, yeah, because I have one that's a little longer. So maybe you could do some quicker ones.
Okay. I do have one that's very much tied in with Saturn and Sag. It actually has a bunch of different themes, and there's a bunch of themes that are relevant to it. But there was this post on Reddit earlier this year that I thought was really interesting, and it was titled, that caught my attention. It was titled "Scientist Turns Astrologer During Saturn Return." And I sort of talked with her a little bit, and I'm not going to be able to retell her entire story, but I did want to retell a little bit of just her post from Reddit. And she said it was okay if I shared her chart, but not her name. So hers is relevant because she actually has Aquarius rising. Can you guys see the chart right now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so she has Aquarius rising and Saturn ruling the ascendant using the traditional ruler of Aquarius, and it's in Sagittarius in the 11th whole sign house with the degree of the meridian midheaven and conjunct Uranus at 27 Sag. So her thing that was interesting is that, or her basic pitch, at least in the Reddit post that was really interesting, is it was titled "Scientist Turns Astrologer During Saturn Return." So I'm going to read some of it because with a lot of these stories, I'm actually not going to do a very good job of retelling it. But if I give sort of a snippet from the original description, I think that does a better job. So, and originally that was going to be how I was going to structure this episode, as I debated for months whether to do individual interviews with these people and then play those snippets, or just have like, you know, a group of a few of us like we are doing now where we talk about them. And I decided to go with this route because I didn't think I would be able to fit in a bunch of Saturn return stories if I did the interview route, because it would take too long to actually do those interviews. But this is sort of the middle ground that I thought I would go with. So here's the post. She says, yep, that's me. I'm a grown damn woman, doctorate bearing scientist, atheist, and now I'm in love with astrology. She says, I'm a solar Capricorn with a Pisces moon and Aquarius rising. My mom always said I was sensitive, and I thought, and I told her how she was full of shit. I now have no choice but to believe her. I recently told my partner of 10 years that I'm bisexual. Piece of cake. Telling him that I've been reading about astrology, mind-blowingly difficult. So she's like, coming out about my sexuality, fine. Telling him I'm an astrologer, really difficult. My favorite authors have always been the modern atheist writers, but now I can't stop listening to astrology podcasts. I've tried explaining astrology to my partner, how just because it doesn't fit within the modern parameters of the scientific method, that it's still a valid tool for exploring the world, that I'm aware of the confirmation bias, etc. He continues to make jokes. It is very difficult for me to reconcile this newly discovered affinity for the stars. I've always had a fascination with intuition, the sky, introspection, but I never thought I'd turn into a huge hypocrite because of it. Seriously, though, you can't make this shit up. Like every good friends or partner I've had birthdays in the same 2-week window in June. That's like 8 different people, all with those same birthday weeks. And I keep asking new friends when their birthdays are, and they're all in June. My partner doesn't want me spending money on it, and so I won't be buying a reading anytime soon. I'm trying to just listen to it all longhand way, so I can just read my own chart. Wish me luck as I pray to my ruler Saturn, who apparently materializes as my boyfriend. So that was her initial post. I actually talked to her, and she's had a number of other interesting Saturn return themes. Saturn's in her 11th house, and she previously was not a very social person. And then over the past few years, she's gone through a complete transformation and suddenly is like a very social and is very connected with different social groups. So there's a bunch of other themes that are relevant. So I don't want to make it seem like that's the only thing that came up with her Saturn return. And in fact, there's a lot of other interesting things. But just in terms of situating this and talking about some ones where the sign of Sagittarius itself is relevant in terms of describing some of it, this seems like another one in terms of somebody who's struggling with going through the Saturn return and having a sudden, challenges and change to their worldview and to their belief system and the structures that were previously built into their life up to this point as a result of that. Mm-hmm. So yeah. That seems consistent with some of the ones you've found as well, right, Leisa?
Yeah, and this one's kind of interesting too, because not only Saturn and Sagittarius as a general thing can bring that up, ideologies and, challenges around that, but Saturn can also bring changes or bring challenges to planets that are ruled by Saturn during the Saturn return. And so this person has the ruler of the ninth house is Venus, and Venus is in Aquarius in the first house. And so during the Saturn return, Saturn would also be ruling that ruler of the ninth house, very prominently placed in the first. And so that makes sense both in terms of the ruler of the ninth in the first being like she's gotten a PhD, you know, higher education being a ninth house topic, and so that being prominent in the person's life, but also the ninth house being astrology and sort of, you know, worldviews. And so I see it kind of echoing in both of those things, the Saturn in Sag as just the basic sign, as well as Saturn ruling the ninth house ruler.
Sure. And one of the things I've realized also over the past few years is I keep seeing when Saturn's like the ruler of the first house, that the first house and the notion of self like really does become one of the primary keywords and one of the primary themes of the Saturn return, and that there's something where the person sometimes themselves goes through a transformation or has a major change to something about how they see themselves or their perception of themselves or how the world sees them. And sometimes that's one of the dominant themes in the Saturn return when it's ruling the first house, or sometimes when it's in the first house.
Well,
Yeah,
you're
definitely.
Aquarius rising, Chris, aren't you?
Yeah, well, and that was really funny. Well, and you know, it's a little personal, but one of the things that was funny during my Saturn return that was a big unexpected thing was that I lost, you know, my hair. I started losing my hair during my Saturn return and like struggled with that. And so it was a very literal, like, you know, how I view myself and how the world views me, and eventually around that time deciding just to start shaving my head. So that seems like a really kind of minor blow off thing, but for me at the time, it was kind of a big deal, and it had to do with themes of like self-perception and other things like that.
Yeah, but now you look like super like cool and like super like hard. Like, you know, it's a good look. You wear it well. Like if I was bald, it would like I wouldn't be able to pull it off quite like you do. So no,
Sure.
it looks, it's very it's, you know, Saturnian is I mean, Saturn's not Venus, but Saturn's, you know, Saturn.
Right. It's like looking like having a more mature identity.
Mature,
so the first house being identity and appearance.
Serious,
you know?
sober. Yeah, it's
so
good luck.
Yeah. So, well, it's just funny because when I was, you know, growing up, I always had like long hair, like down to my chin and stuff like that.
I know.
So
Oh my gosh.
if you look at any of my old pictures, it's very funny. Anyway, so that was something that was like really funny for me going through that with Saturn ruling the ascendant, but it's something I've seen in other ones too, that actually, and so, you know, I'm going to transition away from this example. I want to thank her, who I don't want to mention her name because I don't want to give away any identity things, but there's other things that she mentioned that were relevant, but I wanted to use it primarily for that reason, just because that was such a great post on Reddit. And people can search for it and find it if they want, just to read that and some of the other comments in that thread. So that thematically, though, actually brings me to another chart that's sort of connected with that, which was Shia LaBeouf. So here is his chart. So his was one of the ones I was interested in because we have a time chart for him, and he also has Aquarius rising, and Saturn is at 5 degrees of Sagittarius in the 11th whole sign house, conjunct the degree of the midheaven. So his was really interesting because for like a few different reasons, but one of the things, of course, that was super interesting just from an outsider's standpoint is that the week of, or around the day of his exact Saturn return, around the week of his exact Saturn return, he did this thing called All of My Movies, where he had been a child actor since he was really young, and he was on like the Disney Channel and did all this other stuff. And then eventually, as he went into his teens and early adulthood, was doing major sort of blockbuster films like the Transformers series and eventually like Indiana Jones and other stuff like that. And the week of his exact Saturn return, he ended up like renting out a movie theater and sitting there, and he watched all of his movies that he had done since he was a little kid straight through for like an entire week. And he live streamed it. So there was a camera like pointed at his face as he was reacting to like basically reliving his childhood and much of his life up to that point. And he literally, you could see he was watching himself having grown and progressed over the course of his life through his movies. and everybody was sort of watching this, and it became this interesting sort of social phenomenon where people were watching this guy reliving his life at this very pivotal moment of his exact Saturn return. So one of the things that we don't know, that I was always curious about, of course, is we don't know if this was deliberate, if he or the two friends, because this is part of an art project, which is an interesting sort of tie-in with the 11th house, which is that this was one of several different sort of avant-garde sort of like art exhibits that he did with these two other friends over the course of the past few years, probably drawing in the 11th house placement of Saturn. But we don't know if they were aware that that was his exact Saturn return, and that's what gave them the idea to do that, and that's why they set it up for that, literally the week of his exact Saturn return, or if it just happened to work out that way and they just happened to schedule like him watching all of his movies the same week as his exact Saturn return, which would be pretty weird and pretty cool. But that was one of the real notable or memorable ones, and it was tied in with, again, this is another example of somebody who had Saturn ruling the ascendant while having his Saturn return.
Mm-hmm.
Also rules the 12th and Mars. I wonder what that could be about.
I was going to say that too. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and go ahead and expand on that.
Oh well, wasn't he arrested? He was arrested a couple of times actually, and the 12th is, associated with prison or being removed away from society, and he has Mars retrograde in the 12th, so that would sort of indicate troubles in this domain. And so so during his Saturn return, he was arrested for I think one time it was like for he was like publicly intoxicated, and then like another one was over the course of one of his art exhibits, the He Will Not Divide Us exhibit that he had. He was carted away by police, so he's got in trouble with the law a bit, over the course of Saturn being a Sagittarius. And of course Saturn rules not just his first but also his 12th, which contains his well, no, actually Mars isn't his contrary to Sect malefic, but it's still a malefic in a bad house. So sort of highlights how when you're in the middle of a Saturn return, when Saturn's back in the natal sign, that it's activating or putting some sort of emphasis on any planets which are in Capricorn and Aquarius, and the topics that they rule house-wise.
Yeah, definitely. And that was hugely relevant also because one of those live art exhibits that you mentioned was the He Will Not Divide Us one, where they opened up an exhibit at some museum or something with like a live stream camera pointed out to a field connected with a museum. And it was like him and a group of people chanting, "He will not divide us." And it opened on January 20th of 2017, the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated. So it was like a Trump protest. And that is actually interesting. You mentioned that in terms of drawing in the 12th house, because one of the main traditional 12th house themes is also enemies. And that exhibit actually ended up sort of riling up like a sort of internet mob from like 4chan against him. And they started trolling him basically, like sort of incessantly in this art exhibit, and continually kept getting it shut down as a result of that. So there were some interesting things with that as well.
Yeah. Interestingly, Mars is supposed to rule, separation and division, and he has Venus right opposite that Mars. So of course, the name of the exhibit is "He Will Not Divide Us." Venus cool. is about bringing things together. Mars is splitting apart. Anyway,
and the final thing that was relevant here also is just you pointed out that Saturn in this chart, he has a night chart. He has the Sun in the 5th house, so Saturn is going to manifest its more difficult significations, or Saturn's going to be the more problematic planet for him compared to Mars. And what's interesting when that happens, when Saturn is also the ruler of the ascendant, and Saturn is therefore representing the self, is that sometimes there's something that comes from within the native that causes the problems. Because if Saturn is the planet that's going to cause problems in the chart because it's a night chart, but then Saturn is also the ruler of the 1st house, which is the house that's most closely associated with the native, then sometimes it means there's something the native does or something about who the native is that itself is the source of the problem sometimes in their life. And so that's when you do sometimes run into issues, or that's where some of the things you mentioned about him, running into issues with the law due to like public intoxication or whatever that was, and some of the struggles or other things that he's had over the course of the past few years become, potentially relevant.
It
was also
in the top too, in terms
right.
of intoxication, right?
Well, and it was also just relevant as well because it's been interesting seeing him go through this maturation process over the past 2 or 3 years, because I feel like up until 2 or 3 years ago, it almost became a meme that he was not, there was a lot of people like that didn't like him or didn't like his movies. And it was almost like a cliche sort of online thing. But over the past 2 to 3 years, I think it's been interesting the way that in which he has changed his image in some ways. And there has been a bit of a change, especially very early on when he did the All My Movies sort of exhibit. There was something very endearing about that, where people sort of got some insight into and understood who he was and why he was what he is now as a result of growing up as like a child actor. So there were some changes there as well.
He definitely threw off the old image of him, but I guess he, in some ways, I think he replaced it with this kind of unstable or like crazy image. I'm not sure. Maybe he'll come into that when Saturn enters Aquarius, and he sort of more fully, embodies, Saturn, in the sign of his ascendant. But yeah, I think the meme is now with Shia LaBeouf that he's kind of unstable. Although it's funny because Shia LaBeouf has also kind of poked fun at that as well, with that YouTube video where someone wrote this whole song about him, imagining him as a serial killer, like coming to kill them, and like having a fight, and he's like a cannibal, and he's like out in the woods, and he's gonna get you. And then at the very end, after this huge, elaborate like choral and production with an orchestra and dancers, it sort of pans back, and you just hear that like one person clapping in the audience, and it's Shia LaBeouf, who has just watched this song about him, like being a story. So like he kind of, it's like he knows, that people think this about him. So now he's just kind of, throwing up his middle fingers at it in a way.
Right. No, that's a really good point. It's like he's in on the joke, or it's like he's aware of the public's perception of him and sometimes uses that or plays that with that in different ways. That's interesting. And I think that's partially a manifestation of Saturn ruling the ascendant. And that's why we've seen him and some of his personal transformation be part of that over the past few years.
Definitely.
Anyway, so that's one example I thought would be good sort of in terms of being tied in with that. So let's see. Where should we go from here? So a lot of my other examples are house-based in terms of the rulers of different houses and showing the activation of, the topics associated with those houses as being relevant to the way Saturn manifests. Are there any other ones that we should touch on first before we go there?
A fairly contemporary one that I noticed just the other day. I don't know if you have the chart, but it's Kesha.
Yeah, I've got the chart.
Yeah, so she has Saturn, I think, at 20 Sag, and over the summer, she released this song called "Praying," which Saturn and Sag. Sag has these connotations of belief and praying. I guess you could associate with that. And she released this song when Saturn was just at 22. Sagittarius. So she'd probably finished the recording for this song, obviously before that July 6th date. So I imagine she probably recorded the song at her Saturn return, because it was really just a few weeks before the release of this song that she had her Saturn return to the degree. And of course, this song, Praying, it was sort of billed as her comeback song after the whole saga of this sexual assault allegations that she made against this producer she worked with, Dr. Luke, and the legal entanglements she had with her record company were kind of forced her to work with this guy who she said like sexually abused her, and she wasn't able to put out any work until, I'm not sure exactly how that all got resolved and she was able to start releasing music again. But I think it's interesting just from I guess from the point of view of the sign, but also just as an interesting example of what happens when Saturn reaches the degree, that this is when she produced this piece of music, this, you know, work of art basically, in which she kind of lets all of those kind of puts the past behind her, and kind of embraces a new beginning in her life. That's the way she if you watch the music video, at the very end of the song it says a new beginning. I have a quote from her. A lot of people have thought this song was very remarkable because Kesha was mostly known for these very upbeat, you know, kind of filthy, dirty pop, like party anthems. And she had this very kind of gritty and kind of gross image in some ways. But, you know, with this Saturn return, now that, you know, a lot of critics have remarked about how this song has such a different sound. I mean, it almost sounds like an Adele song. It could have been done, but, you know, it's very soulful. You know, it's a complete change from what the kind of music she's made before. So it sort of shows how she's like matured as an artist, as a singer. And she said, for example, I've never been more excited about a piece of art I've ever done in my entire life. This is truly from the inside of my guts. And she said, I've channeled my feelings of severe hopelessness and depression. I've overcome obstacles. I found strength in myself, even when I fell out of reach. I found what I had thought was an unattainable place of peace. So the song is about coming to feel empathy for someone else, even though they hurt you or scare you. It's a song about learning to be proud of the person you are, even during low moments when you feel alone. It's also about hoping everyone, even someone who hurt you, can heal. So, I mean, in all of that, in all of her explanation of this song, Praying, you can clearly pick out a lot of the kind of Saturn and Sagittarius themes. You know, Jupiter is also associated with like forgiveness. And so that's kind of the main theme of the song, that she is, you know, not necessarily forgiving and forgetting what happened to her, but, you know, she says, I pray, I hope you find your peace, you know, but I'm moving on, kind of thing. So I thought it's a very, just kind of a clean example of, you know, a Saturn Sagittarius return.
Yeah, definitely. Because she's, you know, been in some struggle over the past few years. So it was really notable that she finally released new music, because she was somebody who was very successful in like the late 2000s. And then suddenly there was this sort of controversy because she was in a contract with like a music producer, and then she alleged that he had sexually assaulted her. And then there was like a court fight, but then it's like his side, the music producer, was saying she was just saying this to get out of the contract, and she was saying, no, I was assaulted, and I do not want to work with this person anymore. But then it got held up in the courts, and as a result of that, she couldn't release any music at all, and her career kind of started disappearing, even though she was at the height of her prominence. And so now all of a sudden Saturn, as you noted, just shortly after the exact return, after it would have been, she's suddenly releasing new music again somehow.
Right. And this song, because of the experience she's had, this song has almost become kind of like an anthem. I heard this on the radio. Some DJ said that this song is sort of becoming a kind of anthem for the Me Too movement online, which I know is kind of more of a Jupiter and Scorpio thing, but I think it's interesting regardless that this song kind of, you know, is tied up with this Saturn Sagittarius thing for Kesha. Anyway, right. So that was that.
What's interesting too, what you said about the quote with you know, Jupiter in Pisces ruling this Saturn Sagittarius example, which is the first one, maybe the last one had that too, but we had Jupiter in Aries before, and that was much more the forgiveness piece, and the empathy piece, even if it was something that really, you know, hurt her or hurt her career, was really an interesting manifestation of the ruler of this Saturn and Sag, I think. The other thing is sometimes I notice that when it gets to the exact degree, you know, you think of Saturn much more in terms of like impediments or things being kind of held back from something that you want.
Right.
But sometimes I've noticed, like this example that you've brought, and I remember doing a Saturn return story about one like this too. It's almost the opposite. Like you're released from the impediment at the exact Saturn return.
Well, and she has Saturn conjunct Uranus.
Uranus, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And the music
reversals.
video, right? The music video is like an explosion of color and, you know, totally about. I mean, not very Saturn-y. Saturn-y is much more, you know, Saturn's associated more with darkness, you know, but this is a total kind of, you know, just a rainbow of optimism kind of. So it's, you know, much more Uranus in Sagittarius.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah, in that Uranus conjunction, one of the themes that I see is reversals as a potentially prominent, not as a potentially prominent, as something I've seen come up a few times as reversals. So in her instance, this is more of a positive reversal where she was being stopped or blocked or held back from doing something for a while. And then suddenly after the exact return, she's freed or sort of liberated to do something once again.
Right.
One of the other reversals that I've seen that was like really prominent in the news for a while around the middle of Saturn and Sagittarius was Ronda Rousey, the MMA fighter. So here is Ronda Rousey's chart, and this is actually a time chart because she was born in California. So unlike the last chart I meant to mention with Kesha, where we don't have a time, so we don't know if it's a day chart or a night chart or what house it's placed in, so we're just talking in general. This one is more timed, although still really it's only necessary to talk in general about it at this point, where you know, it's hard to convey, and somebody like Austin would do a better job because he was an MMA fan, but even not being an MMA fan or somebody that's following it super closely, it's like if you followed this over the past few years, just in the general public, you like Ronda Rousey became the face of female MMA fighters, and she brought that to like a new level of sort of respectability and notability and everything else, and was really became the face of that whole sort of profession and that whole thing, both from an entertainment standpoint, but also from a sports and other standpoint. She also started getting like roles in movies. I think she was in one of the Fast and Furious movies. She just became huge, and she also looked kind of like unstoppable, to the point that people really talked her up a lot. And some of that was probably marketing, but it was also, some of it was, you know, she seemed like just this powerhouse in terms of mixed martial arts fighting and winning a lot and couldn't be stopped. And then all of a sudden, you know, she went through her Saturn return and she went into this major fight and she lost, and it was a major upset and a major reversal. And it was just crazy how virtually overnight, just the entire narrative about her and her career and everything else just suddenly changed. And suddenly, you know, the public was just heaping like tons and tons of scorn about her and saying she had been overblown, and that you know, just the narrative about her just suddenly changed almost overnight after that first loss. And I know that she went through like a very difficult period after that fight, that first fight that she lost, in terms of struggling to retrain and think if she could make a comeback and everything else. And then eventually she did another fight, I think about a year later, and she lost again in another major upset. And after that second one, the narrative was very bad. So it was a very difficult period in her life, but it was a really good example in terms of an unexpected negative reversal or a sort of fall from grace type situation, I think.
Yeah, and I remember actually paying attention to one of those, even though I otherwise don't follow those sports, because it was so built up, you know, it was in the public consciousness no matter what. And it was it wasn't just a major reversal, it was like an absolute sudden, it was like 30 seconds or something, one of the fights. She was knocked out in like 30 seconds. It was crazy. And she had been paid so much for that fight. It was being it was like a pay-per-view.
Right. So it's like she made a lot of money, but it was a hugely embarrassing and hugely sort of unexpected, but also just a reversal and a fall from grace. And it went from somebody who she was almost like, I'm trying to think of like some of those other athletes who are just at the top of their game and everyone thinks the world of them and they're sort of put on this pedestal, but then, sometimes something happens and they fall off of that. And sometimes the fall is just really devastating or is just really notable compared to where they were even a short time before that. And that's a lot of that seemed to be about her Saturn return story.
Yeah, what about definitely.
Sect, I mean, this is one of those examples where because I don't follow her life and I don't know much about her personal life, I don't know. One of the things about hers is, for example, because it's in the 7th, it's ruling the 8th and the 9th, I think a lot of this is going to end up being about where does she go from here and what does her life story end up being after this point if this chapter of her life is closing down. And I think that's part of what's happening, and so it's not necessarily going to be clear to us as outsiders, and that's one of the difficulties dealing with celebrity charts, where you're just looking at from the outside about whatever you actually know or what's documented about the person. So I
did just check the transits though for the first fight that she had where she lost. Uranus was 1 degree off from her Mars. So
right,
and Mars does return to its general position, every 30 years, because if you add 2 15-year periods together, it's not as close a return as 32, but at 30 years, Mars is kind of back in a similar phase as it was in birth. So, but the other thing is that with Saturn conjunct Uranus, her Saturn transits are going to be a bit more Uranian, and then the fact that she had like this big Uranus transit to a Mars on the night of her first defeat, I think, still says that Mars, factors in here as the contrary to Sect malefic. But I guess we'd have to conclude that the Saturn return is in some way going to be constructive in her ultimate, in the sort of totality of her life. We just, like you said, we don't quite know. It's not as obvious.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's and my usual, this is one of the examples that seems to go against my usual interpretive principle, which is that typically people with day charts, my keyword for the Saturn return is a surmountable difficulty. It's like something that comes up and it's the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And you have to get over a major hurdle, but eventually you're able to surmount it and you learn and grow and whatever as a person as a result of those difficulties. Whereas the night chart people sometimes just run into a major roadblock or obstacle where they can't proceed further down that specific road and have to sort of submit to it in some ways or just go an alternate route sometimes as the insurmountable difficulty. Basically, hers is a little bit different because this is a day chart and she clearly did run into an insurmountable difficulty to the extent that she lost 2 major fights.
Oh, well, Mars is actually directly applying a trine to us.
I was going to say that actually, because Mars is the malefic contrary to Sect. It's ruling the 6th, which sometimes has to do with bodily issues. And she was pretty badly beat up in that one where she was knocked out in 30 seconds. And even though it's a trine, and Mars is in its own sign of Aries, both of which, make things more constructive, it is still technically the malefic contrary to Sect, applying to Saturn for the Saturn return. And that is one of the interpretive principles as well, usually, is if Mars is involved in a day chart, that does make the Saturn return more difficult, even though typically it's more like if it's a square or opposition or something.
And so then with Uranus on top of the Mars, that would supercharge the malefic contrary to Sect, which is then applying to a Saturn. Yeah. Yikes.
I mean, and one of the things you mentioning this, the Uranus transit to Mars, that I meant to say in the preliminary statements that we should be aware of and careful about is we're focusing on the Saturn return here, but the Saturn return is not everything. And for all of these people, there's oftentimes other major transits happening at the same time, which can sometimes add to or be descriptive of or be even sometimes more important factors that are actually describing some of the major events that are happening at that time. But, we're focusing on just one slice of that, but we should definitely keep in mind that there's other Time Lord periods, there's other timing techniques that are sort of active and running that we're not necessarily talking about in each of these examples. So it's not always necessary that everything has to be like the Saturn transit or the Saturn return or found through that lens. But indeed, oftentimes there's other stuff going on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, hers is an interesting example. Austin and I often talk about that as contrasted with Conor McGregor, who is actually a night chart and also lost a major fight, but it was less of a major devastating loss because it was almost like more anticipated in some sense that he would lose. So there's an interesting inversion there of the rule, and I'm not really fully sure yet what to make of that. But Ronda Rousey is one that I wanted to highlight because it's a much more typical cliche sort of fall from grace type example. And part of that probably is the fact that it's ruling the degree of her MC, which is in Aquarius. But there's some 9th house and some 8th house things tied in with that and 7th house things in terms of relationships that I don't fully understand. But perhaps if we knew her or were privy to information about her personal life, we would sort of understand better. All right, so that is that example. Let's see, Leisa, I know you had one more that would be a good Saturn and Sag sort of general example to talk about before we get into more house rulership ones, and that was Daryl Davis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's my favorite Saturn and Sag example right now, and this is a second Saturn return, which is a little unique because a lot of the ones we're talking about are first.
Right, so we've focused, and that's another preliminary thing I forgot to mention, we're focusing here on the first Saturn return because that tends to be more important because it's like that final passage to adulthood. But people have second and sometimes even third Saturn returns, and those can also be pretty pivotal as well. And this is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is an untimed chart, but we do have the date. So March 26th, 1958. He's got Saturn around 25 degrees of Sagittarius. And this one, I've been kind of paying attention, especially with these untimed charts, to the planet ruling the Saturn, which is Jupiter in all of these cases. So this one is Saturn and Sag ruled by Jupiter in Libra, and so in a nice sextile and also ruling it. And it's just such a perfect example of that configuration and that rulership. So his story is that he is a musician who was somewhat famous in his own right for that, but he also became famous for befriending a large number of Ku Klux Klan members. And he's, I should say at the start, he's an African-American man. And so he became famous for one by one befriending people who were in the Ku Klux Klan or other sort of hate groups or white supremacist groups, which is pretty unusual. And a number of them over the past about 30 years have renounced their membership in the KKK. And very uniquely, vividly, they've given him their robes and their different accoutrements that are part of being the KKK, and he's collected them. And so he's got this large collection now of KKK, paraphernalia and clothing and so forth. And so this is, and actually a lot of the people who did renounce membership eventually were kind of high up. They were like state leaders, county leaders, grand dragons and things like that. So it's just a unique story in itself. But of course, it's so perfectly the sign of Saturn and Sagittarius. It's crossing to those who are different than you, or crossing to radically different ideologies than you, and seeing if you can get there from here, kind of like your bridge thing, Patrick, but in more of a cultural terms. Can we reach each other through even this great expanse? And so this was really amazing. So during his second Saturn return, there was actually a documentary made about his life called Accidental Courtesy. Okay, is that not another Libra word? Courtesy. And his entire methodology through these past few decades has been the what he was doing was the Saturn in Sag, but the how he was doing it was the Jupiter in Libra, because he was cultivating these personal one-to-one relationships over and over and befriending these people. And that's how he kind of, made them come around. So yeah, there was this documentary made during his second Saturn return, last year, which was kind of notable in itself because often that's what you see, especially with second Saturn returns, but sometimes third, but even occasionally first, if people have been doing something for a while that's notable, sometimes there's kind of a capping off or a display of what they've been doing or winning awards or, that kind of thing. So anyway, he had a documentary made about his life last year, and it premiered on PBS's, this was not the initial release was last year, but it premiered on the PBS's Independent Lens this year on February 13th, 2017. That was actually the exact return to the minute of his Saturn return, not even to the degree. That was the day of his exact Saturn return, which was amazing.
Wow. See, and that's really interesting because that's clearly something that wouldn't be in his control, or like nobody scheduled it like that deliberately. It just happened to come out, at his exact Saturn return.
Right, exactly. And
that sort of goes back, and that's why with the Shia LaBeouf example, even though it's possible that they did do that deliberately, or it's pretty possible, it's also, possible that it just happened like that accidentally. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you don't really know, because sometimes it really does happen very tightly or exactly with some of these alignments.
Right.
Did he start doing this at his first Saturn return?
I was trying to nail down dates before. It wasn't clear. It seemed like kind of the impulse started around then, because he said in 1983, which I think would have been Saturn in Libra, was the first time he met someone from the Ku Klux Klan, and they were like, "I've never talked to a black man before." And he was like, "Why?" And they were like, and then they said they were in the Ku Klux Klan. And then he said he'd been collecting robes since 1990. So I got the sense that in between the two was when something kind of started, but I couldn't get a firm date.
Right.
Yeah. So this is, an amazing Saturn and Sag, just kind of bridging differences, which are good, Saturn and Sagittarius keywords. He talks a lot about educating others and educating oneself about others in order to bridge those ideologies, an ideology also being a Sagittarian word. And he has this catchphrase that he repeated through the documentary was, he was like, "How can you hate me when you don't even know me?" Which again keeps repeating, the Saturn and Sag ruled by the Jupiter in Libra. Like he wanted people to get to know him and vice versa in order to bridge these, ideologies and change their kind of prejudices. And another reason why I thought this was an amazing example was because he actually, it already sounds like this kind of crossing of subcultures, but he actually additionally was raised outside of the US for many years until age 10. And so that also brings kind of another layer of difference in terms of what you've grown up with. And he has this great quote that was like, "I've been in 53 different countries. I've been exposed to many, many different cultures, races, religions, socioeconomic statuses. I look at the Ku Klux Klan as simply another culture. I don't look at them the same way I might have looked at them had I grown up in this country and had to fight bigotry my whole life." And then he says, "Yes, I fought it, but not my whole life." And so it kind of makes him coming from a different vantage point than if he grew up here, from age 0. So, which actually then interestingly goes into him meeting with some people who do yell at him in the film, which are some young Black Lives Matter activists, and also someone from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an anti-hate group. That person didn't yell at him, but they clearly all disagreed with what he was doing. And that was interesting to me as well in terms of Saturn and Sag, because it's like they were all supposedly on the same side, but it's still, you're still, so even the Saturn and Sag kind of bridging cultures or bridging ideologies, you're still going to get flack, even if you're sort of doing something that would be considered admirable much of the time.
Right.
Definitely.
And this is also a really good example in terms of mitigations and in terms of the configuration of Saturn in the chart, and whatever those configurations are partially dictating the experience of the Saturn return, because this is like an extremely well, we don't have a time for it, but at least just in terms of the aspects to Saturn, it's an extremely well placed or well aspected Saturn, where you have Jupiter ruling Saturn, as you said, in Libra, but it's in Libra and it's forming or is in a superior sextile within 4 or 5 degrees with Saturn. So we have Jupiter sextile Saturn, which is a positive affirming aspect. We also have Venus sending an inferior sextile back to Saturn from 19 degrees of Aquarius. So the other benefic is also aspecting Saturn, and in fact are basically enclosing Saturn between their rays. You have Mars, the malefic, and it's not making a hard aspect with Saturn. This one's also missing the Uranus themes. So Uranus is in a wide sign-based trine, but it's basically not very connected with Saturn. And so this one is notable from some of the other first Saturn returns that we're talking about from people born in the 1980s, because you don't have that like unexpected reversal type theme coming up here because Uranus isn't present with Saturn.
Yeah, definitely. And I was thinking of some of those configurations too, and how just because this looks great, I could kind of understand people arguing with him. I mean, not only from the, just like how far is too far to bridge, but that not everyone would be successful as he has been doing the same thing. And I think that kind of is attested to by his chart.
Right, that you could attempt the same thing, but fail. It could have the opposite outcome.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially if you're talking to people who, are like willing to, be violent, which many of them were.
Right. You could like attempt it and get killed or something.
Yeah, exactly. So
sure.
Yeah, so he definitely has some great aspects going on that I think helped him be successful in doing this, not just having the belief making him successful that he could do it.
Sure. Yeah. So, and that also brings up an interpretive principle, is that when Saturn returns back to its natal position, it's activating Saturn in its natal position, but it's also it's activating all of the aspects to natal Saturn. So it's like when it gets back in that degree range, it sextiles that natal Venus at 19 Aquarius, and it sextiles that natal Jupiter at 29 Libra. So it's activating all of those aspects as well. And that becomes important as one of the interpretive principles that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what the Saturn return is going to be about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was really struck by all his air planets in general, because his whole methodology was like conversation, basically like congenial conversation. And somehow that worked.
Sure, definitely. All right. Well, that's a good Saturn and Sag example. Issues of like belief, issues of fear, issues of foreigners or foreign places and foreign travel and foreign countries. And also just the issue of like the other and things like that.
And, who is too different to reach, I feel like was one of the overarching themes by the end.
Sure, definitely. All right. So let's see, in terms of other examples, I have a bunch of sort of house-based ones, and I think I want to do a little sort of run through of a bunch of those really quick, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a few different friends, all of us do, that are sort of mutual friends, or I've got a few friends that I've seen go through Saturn returns, and some of their stories have been really interesting over the past few years. Let's see, one of them said I could share her story, but preferred that I kept the data and the name anonymous. So I'm just what I did is I drew a sort of chart. I drew a chart with just her rising and Saturn placement and Jupiter placement, which I'm going to share here on the screen. Let me know if you guys can see this. Does that come up?
Yes.
Okay. So she has Scorpio rising. Saturn is in Sagittarius in the second whole sign house, and it's ruled by Jupiter, which is in Gemini in the eighth whole sign house. And this is a day chart. So I'm actually just going to read the paragraph. So with her chart, so interpretive principles. So let's go back to our basic interpretive principles, which is It's a date chart, so we would expect sort of like surmountable difficulties during the Saturn return. It's in the second house, so we would expect financial matters or her personal finances or livelihood to come up. It's ruling the third house, so we would expect siblings to come up. And it's ruling the fourth house, so we would expect parents to come up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then finally relevant that the ruler of the second itself is Jupiter, which is placed in the eighth house of death and inheritance and other people's money. So she wrote me a paragraph, and she actually had a very long story, and there's a lot of details, but this paragraph does a pretty good job of summarizing the core of it, of what she experienced. So she says, when Saturn first entered Sagittarius, my sister and I were both given a substantial amount of money from our father. About a year later, my sister and I had a falling out over shared resources and business ties involving money. They had a business together. Some months after that, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. About 6 months later, her mother actually died and passed away during this person's Saturn return of cancer. So there's the fourth house, the ruling of the fourth house is both that her father gave her money, so the ruler of the fourth in the second, but also her mother died of cancer. So ruler of Saturn being the ruler of the fourth house. After my mother passed away, we learned we had inherited her divorce judgment against our father and that she had appointed a trustee to go about collecting the debt. We do not get to fire him and have no say in the matter of how he goes about doing this. He's aggressively trying to collect a substantial sum of money from our father that is threatening to put him into bankruptcy so that we kids can, quote unquote, inherit our, quote unquote, our mother's money, even though it's being taken directly from our father's pocket. So what had happened is that her mother and father had divorced years earlier, but had fought a sort of legal battle over the divorce settlement that was never settled. And now that her mother has died, there's somebody who's continuing to fight that legal battle to get the money from the father, supposedly to give to the children, but the children don't want that to happen and just want the whole matter to go away, but it's out of their hands at this point. So it's a really amazing example because you see all of the house placements coming into play in terms of Saturn being in the second house, Saturn ruling the third house of siblings, ruling the fourth house of parents, and the ruler of Saturn itself being in the eighth house of death, inheritance, and other people's money, and all of those themes becoming very literally prominent in her life over the course of the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely.
That's good.
Yeah, it exhibits all of those rulerships. And it's also interesting that with the Saturn being ruled by Jupiter in the eighth opposing Saturn, it's like, you know, the money's still going to come, but it's going to come through like this adversarial or tension-filled kind of relationship because, you know, they're not totally comfortable with how it's coming about, but it's still probably going to come about.
I mean, couldn't they just give the money back to the dad if they...
Like afterwards?
Yeah, just say, look, he's going to take this money, but we'll just give it back to you when he does. Like,
I guess.
Yeah, I have no idea. Well, you know, it would force him to go bankrupt, though, in the process in order to pay it. So who knows?
Yeah.
But anyways, there's actually a lot more details, a lot more nuance. I mean, her whole process of her mother's unexpected cancer diagnosis and then 6 months later dying. And at one point, her mother had made a recovery like a few months into it and went back home. And then suddenly she was back in the hospital. And then shortly after that, suddenly she was gone. So there was a whole story there as well in terms of her processing her mother's death and everything that went along with it that was very important. And it was very much a focal point of the Saturn return as well. So if you actually understand all the nuances and other things surrounding this, it's even more interesting and draws out more of those placements even more. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg, but it's a really great example in terms of showing how those basic interpretive principles work in practice.
Mm-hmm.
wow.
So, okay, so that's my first one. And hopefully, again, with all of these, I'm only sort of scratching the surface of them, but so I apologize to everyone who wrote me like sort of extended stories about their Saturn return because I can't get everything in, but I'm hoping at least we can get some of the main points. So another one is a friend of ours named Ashley, and here is her chart. So this one is, I think there's a little bit of ambiguity because her rising degree is 0 degrees of Libra, and it just clicked over into Libra a couple of minutes prior to the recorded birth time. So there's some ambiguity over the rising sign, but we're, I think, working under a presumptive Libra rising chart, which puts Saturn in Sagittarius in the 3rd whole sign house, ruling the 4th house and the 5th house. And there was a bunch of stuff that went with that, and there was actually a whole story, but one of the primary things, as I understood her Saturn return, as she was like going through it and sort of reporting the process, is that she initially thought she was dealing with health issues and dealing with issues of being sick for several months, especially in connection with some dietary issues. And some of that comes up because she has like the ruler of the ascendant in the 6th whole sign house, and is sometimes very focused on 6th house issues pertaining to like health and diet and other things like that. But with her Saturn return, of course, going through Sagittarius, it was squaring those 6th house placements of Venus and the moon in Pisces in the 6th whole sign house. But then at one point she was feeling ill and thought she had this whole other sort of illness thing going on for several months. And then all of a sudden it turned out, she found out later, that she was actually pregnant. So there was a sort of somewhat unexpected discovery that she had become pregnant during this time, and that some of the health issues that she was dealing with for a short period of time turned out to be that. And then over the course of the next few months, she went through, during the course of her final year of her Saturn return, the entire process of, pregnancy and everything that comes along with that. And then just a few weeks ago actually had her son. Her son was actually born. So this is a really good example of just one of the house rulerships becoming relevant. So Patrick, in your example, it was very much focused on children because Saturn was in the 5th house, whereas this one, it's a good example that even Saturn ruling the 5th house can sometimes make children a large part of the Saturn return.
Totally. Well, and with Uranus again,
yeah, like a surprise pregnancy.
Unexpected. It's
right. So she actually had a bunch of other stuff. So I am going to read this really quickly because I don't want to underplay some of the 3rd house and the 6th house things that she talked about. And I hope that that's okay that I'm reading it. I think, pretty sure she said it was okay that I did this because she wrote up a couple of paragraphs. So she says, throughout the first half of her Saturn return, I thought I should try to channel the energy by going back to school, since acquiring clients as a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine proved challenging. So 3rd house sort of things and going back to school. And I felt that perhaps being more versatile and having a wider scope of practice as a registered nurse or nurse practitioner would open more doors for me to practice acupuncture and oriental medicine, while also being able to financially support myself. Part of this decision was also about redirecting the moon North Node Saturn Uranus square in my chart, since I began experiencing health problems just a few days before my Saturn return began, before Saturn ingressed into Sagittarius the first time. For more than 6 months, I struggled with kidney stones and bladder issues tied due to high concentrations of calcium oxalates in my blood, a byproduct of a strictly plant-based diet that I adhered to for spiritual preferences. I became a bit depressed throughout that period when I tried to maintain my habits without experiencing pain, but ended up needing to make modifications to my diet. This experience, however, made me concerned about my health, since my 6th house is prominent in my chart, and I wanted to mitigate that, if possible, by practicing medicine. After completing 2 prerequisites to apply to a nursing program, I received a message from an editor at Teen Vogue asking if I'd be interested in writing a weekly horoscopes for the new spirituality column. I'd been referred after she reached out to another astrologer and began writing for the publication in July. At this point, I decided to hold off on finishing the last 2 courses for nursing since I wasn't happy with it, and just focus on writing. I was also busy working part-time in a previous professor's community acupuncture clinic and training to teach ballroom dancing in a friend's studio during my free time, so I found myself needing space in my schedule, and writing horoscopes wasn't something I would pass up. Which has a sort of side note. I later picked up another gig writing monthly and daily horoscopes. I was approached about the dailies within the same week that I found out I'd be getting a new vehicle, which I had been without for several years. So she draws in some of the third house travel type significations, ended up becoming relevant during her Saturn return. And the same week, I had conceived my first child who would be born during my Saturn return. The pregnancy and writing dominated the last half of my Saturn return experience. Yeah, and that's really the core thing. So the themes of like writing, becoming a writer, and doing writing professionally, themes of health and illness, themes of, obviously children and pregnancy became a dominant theme in the last year of her Saturn return. And they're also, it sounds like they're going to relocate. She says, last of significance is my move my boyfriend and I are about to make. Within a matter of 2 days, he was told about a job opening and offering a position to practice psychiatry in Connecticut, where we'll be moving in December before my Saturn return officially ends. So at the very end of her Saturn return, right before Saturn leaves Sagittarius, they're going to relocate across the country.
Wow.
And Saturn, of course, is also the ruler of her fourth house, of her home and living situation. Mm-hmm. So that's it. Again, it's another one of those stories where if you actually understood the story and you'd been following it live over the past few months and like seeing the Facebook posts of like her saying, I've been really sick lately and I don't know what's going on. And then her saying, I'm actually pregnant. And then you like seeing the whole pregnancy develop over the 9-month period. It's been an amazing and very interesting Saturn return story from a number of different angles. But again, it's another one of those ones where it's really the house rulerships seem to be really drawing out major themes that became the focus of the Saturn return.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, we're back at 24 degrees Sagittarius, where Saturn is now. And so there's still that last hit, and it sounds like that might line up with when she's moving,
right.
Maybe next month. And the other thing that was kind of interesting is, again, Saturn ruling the planets that are in Capricorn or Aquarius. Saturn in the third by itself in a night chart might not sound like ultra successful writing, but it's actually ruling that Mercury and Aquarius in the fifth and aspecting it as well in harmonious sextile. So it's got reception and Mercury being the general significator of writing as well as the third house rulership.
And Mercury is applying by sextile Jupiter too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so,
kind definitely. Of amplifying the more positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Even though, and it's a night chart, and so that's actually mitigating what would otherwise be a more challenging Saturn placement of Saturn in a night chart.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So
hasn't been totally easy, but
some really good things in there too.
Yeah, too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a good example. So thanks, Ashley, for sharing that. I'm glad we finally got that in there because I've been wanting to share that one because it's been such a great example since way earlier this year, and I wanted to make sure we got that in. There's another similar one though. You guys mentioning the, Mercury in the fifth house and Saturn ruling that makes me think of another example where I asked in the last forecast episode that Austin and Kelly and I did for listeners if they had a good Saturn return story to send them in, and I had a bunch that were sent in. One of them though that's very similar is this one by a listener named Allison, and hers is actually really complicated, but it's very similar to Ashley's, where she also has Libra rising, as you can see here, except she has a stellium. So she has Libra rising, she has Saturn in a night chart in the third whole sign house, and then she has a stellium of planets in Aquarius in the fifth whole sign house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I can't sort of, her story was very long, and so I should have written a synopsis of it, but the main thing that I understood is that she has a specific job, and one of the themes of her Saturn return is she was able to get some additional training and additional education and take some additional education opportunities, which is kind of a third house thing. And she used those in order to learn programming, and she learned 2 different programming languages, which is kind of an interesting manifestation of the third house, where you can think of it like communication. One of the things associated with communication, of course, is languages, and programming itself is kind of like a language. So over the course of the past couple of years, she learned these 2 different programming languages during, as part of her job and as part of like expanding her skills on her job, she also began doing public speaking as a result of that, and gave one or two major talks at conferences, which I imagine having like Saturn in the third house in a night chart would be something that would be very difficult or very challenging at first, but it was something where she was able to do it successfully and sort of overcame some of the things associated with that were difficult in terms of that placement for her. So that's sort of in and of itself interesting. The other interesting point, though, that I think is more relevant to her life in the long term, and one of the things we have to keep in mind, is that this is sort of, an ongoing cycle where we're seeing the completion of the first Saturn cycle, but we're also seeing the start of the second Saturn cycle. So we're seeing the person lay the foundation of the next 30 years of their life, basically, at the Saturn return. And so some of the themes that will be associated with in the person's life in terms of imprinting the person's life are only now just going to start to fully manifest, and then will grow over the course of the next 30 years. So for her, with that stellium of planets of the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter in the fifth whole sign house, one of the things that's interesting is that she has an interest in writing children's books, and she's actually started writing children's books during this time, and making moves towards making that part of, eventually in the long term, what she wants to make into more of her actual career. So that's really fascinating to me, because it's literally the ruler of the fifth house of children in the third house of writing and communication. And
Wow.
One of the things that she's doing is writing children's books.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably she won't be writing them in Java.
Right.
Programming
An
for
unreadable children's book.
Right.
Right.
C++.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's a long 30-year transit. So, but again, it's one of those things that's a very literal manifestation of the ruler of one house in another house. And sometimes if you could try to describe that like archetypally, or get to what the underlying thing is, you can sometimes do a really good job of actually describing what the person will experience ahead of time, if you understand what the underlying placement is, or if you can break it down to its core components.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a ton of other detail that goes along with that story that I'm leaving out, that would have been interesting if I did an actual interview. And the more I go through these, the more I realize that I probably do need to see about compiling something like that, so we can get all of the details behind some of these stories. But those are the sort of most interesting points that I wanted to pull out of that one, since you guys had mentioned that other one with Ashley's chart and the ruler of the fifth in the third.
Wow.
Okay. Let's see. Any points before I go on? Because I've got a few other house ones I wanted to push through, unless you guys have anything.
No.
Nope. Good. Okay. Let's see. So next example, I think I've done all of the friend charts that we had of people that we knew directly. So there was just a few other ones that people had sent in that I want to run through really quickly from listeners. Okay, so this is one. I'm going to throw this chart up. This is for another Ashley, who's a listener of the podcast. This is a time chart. She has Gemini rising, Saturn in a day chart in the seventh whole sign house, and it's ruling the ninth house, the eighth house, and also the degree of the midheaven is also in Aquarius. So there's some 10th house significations there as well. So hers is another one where it's a pretty long story, but one of the things that happened is she got married to her partner of 10 years, who is actually from a foreign country, who is from the UK. And this resolved some long distance or some immigration issues that they've wrestled with for a while as a result of being a couple from two different countries. So on the one hand, you have some of the Saturn and Sag themes coming through. On the other hand, the fact that it's also the ruler of the ninth house is relevant, that she has the ruler of the ninth house in the seventh. And one of the traditional delineations of that you sometimes see is like, you will get married to a foreigner or married to a ninth house person. And then the actual final manifestation of that was at her Saturn return, basically. So I thought that was interesting. She also got her PhD during the course of her Saturn return. and has sort of struggled to find work during the course of that. So you get some ninth house themes of education and some 10th house themes having to do with career, since the degree of the midheaven is actually in the ninth whole sign house and ruling that. So you get overlapping things coming up during the course of the Saturn return. And another one that she was dealing with was relocation and settling down as a major theme, although this seems to be sort of connected to other transits that she was having, like Uranus has been transiting over her sun at 24 degrees of Aries, and that's the ruler of the degree of her IC in Leo, and some sort of unexpected and other sorts of disruptions with that. It's also potentially relevant, and it might be relevant talking about here, the fact that Saturn is squaring Mercury, which is the ruler of the fourth whole sign house, and some of the things that come up to planets that Saturn is aspecting, especially by hard aspect, as sometimes being relevant, although maybe we don't necessarily have to dwell on that here. So she has a bunch of other things. There's a bunch of other nuances and details that go along with that story that actually make it much more interesting. But those are some of the main things that I wanted to highlight just in terms of Saturn's placement in the 7th and its rulership of the 9th and the midheaven. So there was actually a few other marriages and other things in some of these other chart examples now that I'm thinking of it. But this was one of the ones where it was much more evident due to Saturn being right there on the degree of the descendant. All right, let's see. Another house one, just to run through the rest of my house examples, was a listener who wrote in named Ray. And she has Scorpio rising, Saturn is in the 2nd house, and it's ruling the 3rd and 4th house. So that's kind of like our previous person, our friend who had the mother who died and who had a business with her siblings, but then their siblings had a falling out and then they had an inheritance. But this one's interesting because that Saturn is actually ruled by Jupiter and Taurus in the 7th whole sign house in this instance. And her thing is that recently she basically sort of dedicated her life to traveling around the world with her boyfriend and living and working through sort of like distance sort of working opportunities and doing things online in order to support herself. So she's from the US. She was born in Houston. She's currently living in Mexico with her boyfriend. She's had some challenges in terms of working and making a livelihood in order to fund her travel dreams. So a lot of that, or some of what's coming out, is that 3rd house rulership of Saturn ruling the 3rd and ideas of travel, sort of foreign things and moving around. So it's not just a 3rd house thing, but sometimes you'll see those issues of travel coming up in the 3rd house as well. And it doesn't always necessarily have to be just short distance travel. It's also, of course, in terms of her home and her living situation, because Saturn is the ruler of the 4th house. And then finally, figuring out how to fund that stuff, of course, is a 2nd house type issue with Saturn in Sagittarius in the 2nd. So that's basically what I got from that example. I don't know if you guys notice anything else that might be relevant there.
Well, sometimes I've noticed the descendant being kind of like a place of exile, since it's the place furthest away from the ascendant. So, for example, there's been I think we actually had an example just a while back with Saturn in the 7th, where they, I forget which one that was. But I just thought it was interesting with Jupiter on the descendant. It's like, yeah, she's sort of exiled, but it's like supposed to be sort of a grand adventure, with her partner, as opposed to being like sent away or something. It's like it's a Jupiterian experience, something good rather than bad. That's another place to sort of get kind of, typically, I think you said it was supposed to be sort of a 9th house type thing, but yeah, you do sometimes see like travel with the 3rd house as well, even if it's local.
Well, and it probably emphasizes it even further that she's got the ruler of the 10th in the 9th. And you said that she's made that kind of her career, like being, in foreign places.
Yeah, she says, I've been trying to find my place in a digital nomad world. And so she says she's trying to live out her dream of getting to travel 100% of the time. And it's like she's struggling with it. She says, I have not had luck finding decent remote jobs, so I figure I'll have to create an income for myself. And just some of her sort of struggles in terms of finding work or finding ways to fund that, and different things that she's done for work in terms of that. But she says, I've dedicated my life to traveling with my boyfriend and my dog.
The Saturn return to the degree hasn't happened yet, has it?
Yeah, I was going to say that too. She's still got one last hit to the degree.
Right. So that's one of the tricky things in terms of some of these and talking about it in like this final month and a half or so. But she says, I've always wanted to travel, and I've always hated working for someone else and having them dictate when I could take time off and things of that nature. She says, finally, in April, my boyfriend got an amazing opportunity for a 100% remote job that paid the same as his office job where they were living. And he accepted that job in May, and we started planning our escape. So just with Saturn in the second house, a lot of the themes that sometimes come up are like your livelihood and what you have to do to support yourself, and what you have to do for work, and what you do in order to put food on the table and bring in enough money to survive in order to pursue the other activities that you're passionate about. And that seems like one of the recurring themes for her, just based on what she wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. All right. So that's another example that I'm, again, glossing over many, many details. But again, it just brings out some of the house rulerships and placements of Saturn that are relevant. Let's see. I'm trying to go through. I had just a ton of people that wrote in, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to all of them tonight, but there was a few key ones that I did want to mention. Actually, I mean, there's a bunch of others, but those are actually the core ones that I think I can actually get to, because a lot of the other ones have very detailed stories, and I think I'm actually going to do a terrible job of attempting to retell them if I attempt to give my like Cliff Notes version of them. So I might actually leave it at that. Are there any other ones that you guys, oh yeah, I forgot, Leisa, you've actually got another good one that we haven't gotten to yet that's actually a time chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I have one kind of recent one in the news, and then I had one just kind of very quick follow-up from the earlier episode of what's happened later. But yeah, the main one is Ronan Farrow.
There's the chart. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
And let me just...
It's the data?
Yeah, so this one is December 19, 1987, 10:49 a.m. in Manhattan, New York. And he's got his natal Saturn at 24 Sagittarius exactly. So 24 and 0 minutes. And he's actually kind of notable because he's got 5 planets in Sagittarius. And 3 of them are actually within like 3 degrees. So he's got the moon in Sagittarius, and then he's got kind of a pile up in late Sagittarius of Saturn, Mercury, Uranus, Sun, all within 3 degrees. So that makes this kind of a big deal turning point for him in theory. And this was actually one of the ones that made me really glad that we were recording this, you know, quite near the end of the Saturn and Sag transit, because he just had stuff explode recently because Saturn's getting to those late degrees. So the background on him, he's the son of actress Mia Farrow and filmmaker Woody Allen, though there was a big thing a few years back about whether he could possibly be instead the son of Frank Sinatra. That has not, unfortunately, been publicly clarified during his Saturn return. I was sort of hypothesizing it might be.
I don't know. Just wait.
Yes, it's not
Mercury
done.
ruling the IC.
Yeah, it's not right. So, and of course, with celebrities, you never know, you know, what's being done behind the scenes that isn't being put out publicly. So it's possible there's something around that, you know. And a part of why I was thinking that is because he has both the Sun and Saturn in Sagittarius, and both of those planets can sometimes be thought of as signifying the father, and, you know, at least one or the other. And so I figured, especially with that being, you know, actually talked about, you know, his paternity, But that's not been resolved yet. So he's a lawyer and a journalist. He's been really focused on international affairs and human rights. And he's been doing that for many years. But the recent thing that was very public is that, all of those stories about the Harvey Weinstein, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I've mostly read it in print, but I think it's Weinstein. So all of the accusers of Harvey Weinstein of, either sexual harassment or assault, that was initially, the story was broken by the New York Times, but it seems like they were doing kind of concurrent investigations, because Ronan had a story on this in the New Yorker just a few days later, and it had some different pieces that weren't in the New York Times, and some of the kind of more severe pieces that people were willing to go on record for. So
right, it was like the New York Times piece was the initial one that broke the story, but then Weinstein and his lawyers and his company basically just denied it at first, but then a few days later Ronan Farrow drops the second story that had other additional bombshells, and that was when the whole thing just blew wide open.
Yeah. And so that initial piece, the New Yorker piece, was published online at their New Yorker's online site, October 10th, 2017. And then it was put in the print magazine October 23rd. And his exact Saturn return was actually October 25th, 2 days after that. So this is really close. I was really glad, with some of these late degree Saturns that, we wouldn't hear what happened until now. So that's a really big deal. He said additionally that it was the result of about a 10-month investigation, which would place it starting around December 2016 or January 2017. And January was actually the first degree return that he had. He was one of those where, because of the retrogrades, he had 3 exact degree hits. And so the first one was around the time, it sounds like, when he actually started this investigation. The second one was in June, and that sounded like, after I read some more articles about the process of how this came out, it sounded like he was running into obstacles with NBC, who he was working for already, in terms of them being willing to put the story out. And there's a whole back and forth about why that was. But in any case, so June was the second exact degree return, and that's that kind of obstacles piece of the Saturn return, where, if you want something to happen, you might have to keep pushing with persistence for it to happen, rather than it happening easily. And that sounds like this kind of story, where he was trying to publish it initially with the company he was working for, but they weren't going for it. And so eventually they let him kind of go forward, but not with them. And he started filming some of the testimonials and things with his own camera crew, and then presented it to the New Yorker. And then it was finally published during his last exact hit, or right before his last exact hit. So that was perfect to me, both, that this was all happening around his exact Saturn return, which was later in the sign, but that, each piece of it was kind of bookending each degree hit.
And maybe we should explain a little bit what it was, just because it was sort of present because it's a current news story. But if someone's listening to this in like a year or two,
sure,
or 20 years from now, and it's been forgotten or whatever, that.
Right. So it was basically a bunch of female actors who had been either sexually harassed or sexually assaulted in different cases by this major film director, Harvey Weinstein, who is just has one of the biggest, film companies in Hollywood. And if you wanted to work in Hollywood, you would probably run into him. And then it sounds like from a lot of these stories, he would then probably proposition you and threaten, that you wouldn't get work if you didn't, accept.
Right. So the New York Times originally broke the story through long investigative reporting, and then Ronan Farrow, whose chart this is, did a second story with actual interviews of additional specific allegations, and that was the point at which this became a major media firestorm that led to his downfall and led to a lot of other stories coming out about other actors, and a lot of things that are still ongoing. And this was, of course, interestingly tied in a sort of unique way in terms of his story and his history as well, right?
Right. And that's one of the things that I found most fascinating. It would have been interesting either way as a Saturn return story and very, tightly timed to his exact returns. But he, if people don't know already, he's the son of Woody Allen, and one of his sisters is now married to Woody Allen, which, was a whole drama in itself back when that happened. And then a second sister of his accused Woody Allen of sexually abusing her when she was a child. And so he's got both of these like sibling issues, which are interesting because he actually has Mars in a day chart ruling the 3rd house, which has to do with siblings, and it's in the 10th house in Scorpio. And, his career seems to work out for, lots of different reasons that I won't fully interpret here, but that's one of the things that he was well known for before he was known as his own identity, was like he was the sibling of like these people that Woody Allen abused. And so one of the things that it seems like happened during his Saturn return is kind of his own working through his own role in talking about or not talking about some of those issues. And he has this great quote where, so he had a guest column like about a year and a half ago during his Saturn return, where he talks about his father and about the issue in general of not talking about abuse in public and the media's role in kind of, an act of omission aiding perpetrators. And so he said, perhaps I succumbed to that pressure myself. I'd worked hard to distance myself from my painfully public family history and wanted my work to stand on its own. So I had avoided commenting on my sister's allegations for years, and when cornered, cultivated distance, limiting my response to the occasional line on Twitter. My sister's decision to step forward came shortly after I began work on a book and a television series. It was the last association I wanted. Initially, I begged my sister not to go public again and to avoid speaking to reporters about it. I'm ashamed of that too. With sexual assault, anything's easier than facing it in full, saying all of it, facing all of the consequences. And so it seems like that is what his kind of strategy was up until very recently. And so it's really interesting how that's been kind of parlayed into, helping all these other women, not the specific women in his family, but, kind of after feeling bad that he didn't help enough and that he was silent, and realizing that he is a media person now and how the media deals with that. Then during his Saturn return, he went on to help all these other women go public with abuse allegations. And that was interesting to me in general. And the other specific chart reason that was interesting to me is because, as we mentioned a couple times by now, Saturn ruling other planets will matter during that Saturn return as well. And he's got, so you think with what had happened in his family, it would be 3rd house and 4th house issues, right? 3rd house being siblings, 4th house being family. And so we talked about the 3rd house already. 4th house is Taurus, ruled by Venus, which is placed in Capricorn in the 12th house. And so Venus is a general significator for women, but it also rules his family. And so the fact that just seems so poignant that that's placed in the 12th house, because the 12th house has hidden things. And he was talking about his role in kind of letting things like this happen by omission, by not talking about it, by leaving it being hidden. And so I just thought this was a perfect kind of end to his Saturn return, kind of almost making up for what he felt bad about not doing in the first place earlier on in his life.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting and really relevant. There's obviously some sort of connection there, even if it's just like a thematic connection. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and then, we don't know what other private things, because then of course, well, that's a whole separate issue and seems so minor at this point, but the other just issue of who his father is and other things like that. If,
mm-hmm.
just because there's been a lot of speculation that it might be not Woody Allen, it might be somebody else, and whether that came up at all during the course of his Saturn return as well.
Right. Yeah, and if it didn't, I kind of wonder a little bit if it won't in the next transit, not only because Saturn's transiting the 12th and therefore also the ruler of his 4th when it goes into Capricorn, but Capricorn is Woody Allen's 5th house of children too. So something to keep an eye out for.
Well, Venus in the 12th is, you said it was hidden matters, but Venus is also scandals, in particular of a salacious nature, blackmail, things that, are, you wouldn't necessarily want to get out, which is funny that he engages with that in bringing forth the scandalous acts of others and having kind of been around scandalous acts, but then potentially then being a product of a scandal, of an affair with Frank Sinatra that his mom had. So it's really weird how it kind of ties together all of those different strands. Amazing. Right.
And, just the way that also during this really, you can see some of the house rulerships here and everything, but also just during Saturn returns in general, people often feel forced to come to terms with things that have not been easy for them to come to terms with up to that point in their lives, if they have something like that in their life. So it feels like all of those themes kind of coming to the forefront, whereas he was just kind of trying to avoid it all up to this point.
Well, and was all of that with Woody Allen, was that within the Saturn return thing? Because I feel like that was several years ago, but was that actually within the past 2 or 3 years that...
Those speculations?
Well, it was somehow Woody Allen came back up in the news and the whole story came back up again. And it was one of the siblings was saying that Mia Farrow had lied and put the children up to, or that the story of abuse allegations was fabricated. But then Ronan himself, that's part of what prompted him to come forward and say, no, we were not coached or something like that. Was that actually within the past 2 or 3? Was that part of his Saturn return, or was that before that?
In terms of saying that they were coached, that was definitely talked about beforehand.
I know it was talked about beforehand, but for some reason, you were talking about him writing an article in the New York Times or something a year ago. So did he only just write that long ago, a year ago?
It was 1.5 years ago. Yeah, it sounds like his sister Dylan, the one who accused Woody Allen of abusing her when she was a child, wrote a New York Times piece in late Saturn in Scorpio. It was a less than a year before Saturn went into Sag, maybe 10 months before. And so it seemed like it was still in Scorpio, but it was kind of heading towards his Saturn return.
Okay. Got it. And then eventually he wrote that. Okay. Anyway, so that's a really good example, because that's another one of those ones where he was working on that investigative piece for a while, and obviously there were other personal things tied in with his Saturn return, but then around the time of the exact Saturn return, very late in this process, suddenly he publishes this very important piece and therefore becomes very influential in that whole thing that happened. So yeah, that's a good chart, good example.
I would also like to point out that Frank Sinatra has the Sun and Mercury in Sagittarius, and I believe that Woody Allen has the Sun and Jupiter in Sagittarius.
Yeah.
I think it's close to around the same degrees. So although the conjunctions from Saturn would have already happened, that's pretty weird.
Right, that's true.
That they're that close.
Right. Yeah, and that's why when we did the initial recording a couple years ago, I thought that might have come out during the Saturn return. That was partially why, because of Woody Allen's placements as well in early Sag. But who knows?
Yeah, who knows? And like you said, we never know with some of the celebrities. That's one of the advantages of looking at celebrity charts, is sometimes their public deeds are more well documented than the lives of private individuals. But the downside is that then if you're not talking to them personally, you may not know some of the personal things that they're going through or dealing with, or other events in their life that have taken place.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
So who knows if that has actually been a theme for him. And it would make some sense, since it's also the ruler of his ascendant. And so themes of self and who am I and public personal image and things like that, you would think would be part of what would be relevant for his Saturn return.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think that's starting to bring us towards the end of this brief jaunt through Saturn returns in Sagittarius that's lasted for about 2.5 hours at this point. So are there any like major examples that we've overlooked? I know I had to skip a number of people who wrote in, and I apologize for that, but I hope everyone understands, since we're 2.5 hours into this, I couldn't necessarily get to everything. But are there any ones that you guys wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
I just want to talk about the bridge from this Saturn Sagittarius period. I was really curious about what bridge we would, like what kind of new bridge we would get as a result of this Saturn Sagittarius period, since the other ones, have all these other bridges. And I actually just saw it in the news just last week that the first 3D printed bridge has opened to the public in the Netherlands. It literally was just a few days ago that this happened. And I was like, yes, finally, I got my bridge. I got my new, because like different ones have been like, we'd had ones made out of iron, the first steel ones, the first, the first ones to go across the river, first ones to go across like 2 landmasses, first one to go underneath the seabed. So we finally got our 2017 Saturn Sagittarius bridge. It's 3D printed. So like that's the new spin now on, connecting people across bridge. That's going to be the new, construction, method. So I thought that was cool. I thought I finally got my bridge.
Very
That's
exciting.
amazing. With like 6 weeks left of Saturn
Right.
and Sag.
Well, there were a few other ones too. There's also the longest glass bridge was built in China, and you can see through the bottom, and it just goes across like a huge canyon, and it's terrifying to walk on. Fear of heights, fear of going across, fear of a see-through bridge. Yeah, it's pretty sad and sad. So there was that one too. But I got my bridge.
Nice. Yeah, a lot of those mundane things that you mentioned in that Saturn and Sag article you wrote and in the discussion that we had have turned out pretty impressively well. So like I said, people should definitely check that out. And you should do like a video or something as a recap of some of those mundane things, just to do like a victory lap or something like that.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun tonight, guys. I think it's pretty late. It's like 12:30 here in Denver. So, but I'm glad that we got a chance to do this and to talk about some of these examples, because I learned a lot over the past 2 or 3 years, just looking at the lives of some of these people, either that we know personally or that we've been following in the public. And I really wanted to thank, the people that let us use their charts, that sent in charts or wrote a description of their Saturn return, because I think that's helpful for all of us in terms of, what we do as astrologers. Part of the research process is looking at charts like this, and you can only research some of these things. It's one of the difficult things that I didn't understand when I was a younger astrologer, that you can't understand, which is that sometimes you have to see these things play out in person live. And there's something about witnessing that, or sometimes living through it yourself, that does give you a perspective that's much different than just knowing sort of abstractly from reading about it in a book or something like that. It's a much different experience. And there's something about that, the difference between just like knowledge versus wisdom or something like that, that's sort of relevant there.
The real examples, I mean, like history is definitely the best teacher, I think. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't get the feel by reading, when you're actually going through the transit, you get the sort of visceral feel of what's going on in the sphere,
Right. Going through yourself, definitely. And also witnessing it in somebody in the life of somebody that's close to you, or somebody who's a friend, and watching their process of going through it, or writing about it, or even some of these celebrities where it's like a long event that's developing and taking place over the course of months. Like after the fact, years later, you can kind of look back and write a synopsis of this happened. But if you're actually seeing it unfold as it's happening, it's a much different experience. And so, I think we've learned a lot over the past 2 or 3 years just by watching this one little snippet in time of Saturn going through Sagittarius. And I hope that we've been able to take some pieces from that of some of the things that we learned sort of as astrologers, and sort of put that out there collectively for the rest of the community and all of the listeners of the podcast to draw on and hopefully to learn something from as well. So we're gearing up then for our next period of learning is going to be Saturn in Capricorn. So
Yay!
Yay! So you're no longer Saturn returning. You've graduated, Patrick.
Yes. Although now we have Saturn conjunct Pluto and Capricorn to worry about. It's a whole other problem.
Well, what's so funny is so now we're going to see, a bunch of people going through their Saturn returns that have Saturn in Capricorn, which normally is actually a sometimes useful mitigation. Like sometimes the people with one of the things that Leisa shows really well in her lecture, which she sells on her website at lisasheim.com, Saturn in Sect, is that sometimes one of the mitigations, where even if you have a night chart, but you have Saturn in Capricorn or Aquarius or Libra, where it has sign-based dignity, that sometimes that can be enough of a mitigation so that it's not experienced as bad as it could be otherwise if it was just a night chart with no dignity. So we'll be seeing some of those people go through their Saturn returns where Saturn has some dignity, but at the same time, they've both got some heavy outer planet natal placements with Uranus and Neptune, for a lot of them, being in Capricorn at the same time. So it's not just Saturn conjunct Uranus like we've had with the Saturn and Sag people, but it's Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, which is going to be pretty wild.
Yeah.
Especially after last year. Like I really think that one of the main things that a lot of those things happened with in terms of the election and in terms of some of the meddling that has been alleged from Russia and the US and stuff like that had a lot to do with the Saturn-Neptune square. It's going to be interesting to see a bunch of people now going through this Saturn return transit who natally have Saturn conjunct Neptune and Uranus and some of the things that are going to be associated with that.
Right.
So that's going to be fun. We've got a lot to look forward to with that.
Saturn in Capricorn, by the way, builds prisons. That's the thing I've noticed.
All right.
If that isn't ominous.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
we'll talk about that soon.
I look forward to your article on that. So people,
I actually have a video about that already, but.
Oh, do you? Okay. Yep. What's the title of the video?
It's the title of the video is Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn, Butterflies, Sunshine, and Daisies.
Yeah, okay. I like that title when I saw it come out.
Yeah, it's I think that's the title. Rainbow, Sunshine, and Daisies.
Okay.
Because it's just gonna be Rainbow, Sunshine, and Daisies. You have to be positive, guys.
Right.
So what's your website URL again where people can find out more information about your work?
My website is www.bigfatastro.com, and you can find my products, my video lectures on the products tab, and I also have consultations on my services tab.
Awesome. So you're doing consultations, you do Saturn return consultations, zodiac releasing, the whole 9 yards.
Annual perfections, transits, stellar returns. Yeah.
Awesome. And then, of course, your YouTube channel, and you also have a page on Patreon. What's your YouTube channel URL again? You have a custom one, right?
I believe so.
Okay. And I'll put links to all of this in the description page below this video, basically, as well as on the podcast website itself.
Yes, it's youtube.com/bigfatastrovlog. And my Patreon is www.patreon.com/PatrickWatsonAstrologer.
Awesome. And people can get early access to videos, like behind the scenes news and all sorts of things like that. So I recommend people check that out, and I'll put links to your website and everything in the descriptions.
Thanks.
Awesome. And Leisa, you've got, like I said, that lecture on your website, but you actually have the lecture on Saturn returns coming up, right?
I do, yeah. I'm doing on November 15th, if people are watching this soon, I'm doing a talk on Saturn returns and Sect in particular, as well as going into a lot more detail with the mitigations that kind of produces the shades of gray in between the night charts and the day charts, and got a whole bunch of example charts showing all of those different things. So that's November 15th for Nightlight Astrology. It's nightlightastrology.com. And that one's by donation lecture, so you can just pay what you can. But if you miss it, like Chris said, I do have a similar version of the lecture on my website at lisasheim.com.
Cool. So lisasheim.com. And then, of course, our old blog where we have a bunch of different Saturn return stories like this is saturnreturnstories.com. And I've got an article there on interpreting Saturn returns. Lisa's got an article on Saturn returns and Sect. And there's a bunch of other stories that we've posted there about Saturn returns and different things. So check that out at saturnreturnstories.com. And I think that's it. So yeah, and you can find out more information about the podcast at theastrologypodcast.com and my website, which is chrisbrennanastrologer.com. So I think that's it. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Leisa, and thanks, Patrick, for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. And thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you next time.